We need to go ahead and get started. So welcome to Class 7 of the Foster Care Pre-Service Training. We're going to be talking about adoption tonight and how that will impact children and how it will impact you. So I will pass around the roll. Everybody can sign in. I have marked down what classes you've been to and all the quizzes that I've received up through today. So if you haven't done the quizzes yet, get them done. So sign in. All right. So as we get started tonight, I actually want to start things off with a short video.
We all need love. But kids like us just have one thing, a wish. Please, somebody, see me, talk to me, care for me.
I dream to hope for my mommy and daddy, and a good mommy and daddy too. I would always be seeing other kids with families, but I would never see myself with one. When Jasmine was with me, I was important to me because then I knew she was safe and nobody would harm her or anything.
When I was growing up, it was very scary. I felt I was growing up by myself. I didn't have anyone to rely on.
Nobody wanted a 14-year-old. Whatever I could do to make their childhood better, I was going to do it. I told my social worker, go ahead and put my brothers up for adoption without me. Their chances were so much better without me. And that's all I wanted was for them to be happy.
At night, they didn't hug me or anything. They just went to sleep.
One simple word can make all the difference in the life of a child like us. Say yes, and see what your love can grow.
The first night I spent the night there, I looked at their eyes. I felt love. Mom and Dad make me feel like I really belong to a family. I want them to know that they were the family we were hoping for.
It was like hope came back into my life, you know. Before I didn't think I would make it, but now I know that I will always have my family.
When we were at our parents' house, I felt so happy because we were all together. And I knew my sister was going to be with us forever.
I don't have to be lonely anymore. Now I'm just a regular kid.
All right, so any thoughts? What stood out to you in the video? Yes, Latrice.
Kids just want a home. They want a family.
Yeah, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So, any guesses? How many kids in Utah right now are sitting there waiting for a family?
For adoption or?
For adoption.
More than a dozen? 800.
About around 500 at least. Nationwide, that number is about 100,000. So when we talk about this, it's important because one thing that foster care, we remove kids from their parents, and when they can't go back home through reunification, the question then is, okay, now what? And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight and talking about adoption. So we're going to talk about why permanency is so important to children. We're going to talk about what are called the 7 core emotional issues for children when they're separated from their parents long term. And we're going to talk about different events or situations in a child's life that might cause triggers, might cause behavior to happen in a child's life. So as we talk about this, there's a lot of reasons why adoption is the best option for children who cannot go back with their parents. So according to the statistics I have from the state, each year about somewhere between 40 to 50% of children return home through reunification. And then there's a percentage that go to kinship long-term either through adoption or custody and guardianship, but there's a percentage of kids that don't go home and don't have a relative to take them in, and they need somewhere to be. So these are all the reasons that the state looks at that, the advantage of adoption. So the first one is stability and security. For children, in class 1, I talked about the label of being a foster child. And what that means for a child, that your life is different, something's different about you, that label sometimes is a label that you're bad because you're in foster care. And so adoption provides that sense of security and permanence that children need. Okay? It also provides that status as a full family member, that you may already see the child that way, but they don't really feel that way. And other people often don't see them that way. So it sends a clear message that you're part of the family. It also provides, as I mentioned, that lifelong connection and safety net. So anybody in here have kids over 18? Okay. So they turned 18 and just said, see you later, and they moved out and never had needed help or support or anything, right? No?
We're still helping them.
Yeah. And that's a big difference between kids in foster care and biological kids. Is kids in foster care, they turn 18, they graduate high school, and the state says, see you later, have good life. And so adoption provides that lifelong connection that children need. So it gives them more time to prepare for adulthood. So we've talked about the brain a lot in training, and I mentioned the fact that research is showing the brain's not fully done developing until age 24 or 25. But we tell kids at 18, hey, you're an adult now, within certain circumstances. There are still some things where we don't think they're that way. So this allows kids time to transition rather than saying, hey, here's your stuff, have a good life. Adoption allows them to have that support and connection they need. It also provides for them things like grandparents for when they have their own kids, people that they can connect to that can spoil their kids. And there may not be much of this in my life, maybe it is in yours, but they're guaranteed inheritance legally too. So all your millions, they get part of that. So, and there are other things too, just that sense of safety is there, and it helps them mature and grow. So those are all reasons why that's looked at as the best choice when kids can't go home. Now, in talking about that, I've mentioned that kids that age out of foster care don't do very well. So I want to kind of compare some differences here. And so if we compare children aging out of foster care with adopted youth, here's some statistics dealing with kids who age out of care that are kind of startling. So the first one I want to talk about is high school graduation. So statewide, any guesses what percentage of children graduate high school? Statewide.
60% maybe?
It's 86% roughly. What do you think that looks like for kids in foster care? About 50%. So 58% in fact of kids in foster care finish high school. Now that's just high school. So let's kind of step it up to the next level. According to statistics, what percentage of Americans do you think graduate from college by, and we'll say just by age 25? It's 28% of Americans graduate college by age 25. What percentage of kids that came out of foster care do you think graduate college by 25? 3%. Okay. So, you know, in, I believe it was class 2, I showed you the video about Shane, the black guy, that he was very, very successful. And a couple people were saying, well, look at him, he's really successful, he should be fine. But we talked about the fact that's not the norm. The norm is less than 3% attend or complete college. Okay. If we talk about teen pregnancy, statistics show that about 31% of children who age out of foster care experience a teen pregnancy. And so that rate is 3 times higher than the average population. Okay. And if we talk about drugs or alcohol, you know, rough estimates are that about maybe at the most 10% of Americans maybe struggle with some kind of drug or alcohol problem at the most. Okay. With kids coming out of care, that is about 50%. So 5 times higher. If we talk about the next thing, mental health problems. Once again, they probably estimate that around 10% maybe of Americans struggle with some kind of mental health problems of some sort. Kids coming out of foster care, 57% have major mental illness diagnoses. Depression was 2.5 times higher than the general population. And if we talk about being arrested or incarcerated, once again, in America they estimate that about 10% of our population at some point or time will end up being arrested or incarcerated. Okay. For those coming out of foster care, 37% had been arrested for a felony or a misdemeanor, and 1 in 4 will be incarcerated within 2 years of leaving the system. So over 25%. Now, this also doesn't mention homelessness, but they find that over 20% will become homeless sometime after age 18. And so that's pretty telling. And if we talk about employment, 54 to 69% of children aging out of care were below the federal poverty level. And the average income for them is between $2,076 to $5,145 per year. Imagine living on that. Because if you're uneducated, you don't have stability and security in your life, you're not going to be able to find a good job. So that's just some of the stats that are out there which shows why this is such a big issue when we talk about this. So what do you think about that? Yeah, David.
I think I don't know, my brain kind of thinks differently sometimes, but I think it kind of goes back to where you shared that story of how it took a while for your adopted daughter to feel comfortable with touching and being hugged. I think the longer they stay in foster care or whatever the case is, it's like their mind needs to go through that, okay, now I've gotten this part of my life done, it's like a check mark, and the longer they're in foster care, it's like they're being held back from, progressing.
Right.
That's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, and that's pretty right on. They can't experience typical childhood development that all of us experienced in our homes because of that sense of stability, security, and permanence that we had. So they can't progress through those normal milestones that all kids are supposed to go through, but then they turn 18 and it's, hey, have a good life, see you later. That kind of creates a problem. Luana.
Our two kids have graduated from high school, and they didn't produce children while they were in high school. And that was wonderful. That was a great goal. And our son has actually said to us, Mom, I know I probably would be in jail if I hadn't been adopted. And I'm really grateful that I was adopted.
Yeah.
And he is married and employed and doing well. And so is our daughter. So it does make a difference.
And that's the difference that it makes. All right, so we talked about income and employment. So, all right, we're going to do a group activity. So we need to break up into 6 groups. So I've had you count off by 4s. I know you know how to do that. So now the next test is to count by 6s. So we're going to start with Shelley and work our way around the room.
1, 2,
3,
4, 5,
6,
1,
2,
3, 4,
5,
6,
1,
2,
3,
4, 5.
6.
All right, so I need the 1s up in this corner with Shelley, 2s over here, 3s in the middle on that side, 4s, and then 5s and 6s, and you'll need at least one binder in each group. Two's right over here.
Number 1. Shimmy on by. You get the comfy chair. Alana.
Jason?
Yeah, it's small groups today. All right. So if you will look in your binders on page 107, you'll see an article that's labeled Themes in Adoption. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about what are called the 7 common themes in adoption. So I'm going to demonstrate with the first issue, which is grief and loss. And so you're going to replace and take your issue in place of grief and loss. And what you'll do in your groups is you will talk about these 3 questions in your group using the information in your book, and then be ready to share it with the group. So once again, that means there's going to be a spokesperson. So somebody's got to be ready to talk. Now, I mentioned I'll demonstrate for you guys with grief and loss so you can see how this is done. But before I do that, just so it's clear with everybody, Group 1, you're going to be looking at control. Group 2, you'll look at loyalty. Group 3, you'll look at rejection and fear of abandonment. Group 4, you'll look at self-esteem. Group 5, you'll look at trust. And Group 6, you'll look at identity. All right, so with my issue, grief and loss, you ask the question, why might a child feel this way? When a child's been removed and taken into foster care, they've been separated from their parents. They're often separated from siblings. They may have been moved to an entirely different city or town in a different place. They're likely going to be in a new school with a whole new family around them of complete strangers often. So they've basically lost everything. Occasionally, some of their possessions get to go with them, but sometimes they don't even get that. And so it's pretty clear why they're experiencing grief and loss, because of everything that they've lost. So the second question, what behaviors will tell you the child's feeling that way? And this is one of the big things that I want you guys to be aware of. We've talked about that behavior is communication. So as you go through your issues, understand there's behaviors that are related to that issue. And so when you see behavior in a child, it's often an indication that they're struggling with one of these issues, especially with an adopted child. So for an adopted child, we've talked about the 5 stages of grief and loss: shock and denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and then resolution. Okay? And so there's behaviors that go along with each one of those. So for children that are in shock and denial, they seem more robot-like. All the emotion is shut down. They act like it's not a big deal, that they've been removed from everything they've ever known, and pretend like they're fine. They are just kind of going through the motions each day, and they really don't have the ability to comprehend what's going on and to make progress while they're in shock and denial. They can't move forward in life. School's out of the picture. They really could care less about what 2 + 2 is. If they think, I'll never see my birth parents again, 2 + 2 all of a sudden is not very important. So they can't concentrate and focus in school, things like that. So those are signs of shock and denial. With bargaining, what we often see with children who are in that stage is they're described as what we call good as gold, or this is the honeymoon period, where they're just trying to be perfect. If they can just be good enough, either they'll get to go home, or if they can just be good enough, maybe you won't get rid of them too. And so they'll make all kinds of promises to try and avoid the loss that they're experiencing. Okay? With the anger phase, this is when children start to act out. They may be defiant. They may refuse to follow rules. They may yell at you. Occasionally, kids may become aggressive. They may become destructive of property. And, you know, just not follow any of your household rules. All those things find ways to try and push your buttons and make you upset because they're angry about what's happening to them, something they have had no control over. And they want to make sure everybody knows about it. If we talk about depression, this is where kids are just kind of giving up. It's hopeless. I'll never see my birth parents again. I'm never going to get to go home, so why do I even care? Why do I try? In this phase, they'll often isolate and withdraw from everybody, both physically and emotionally. Grades, once again, may go way downhill because they just don't really care about anything when they're in that phase, and it's just not worth trying anymore. And then finally, resolution or acceptance, when they get to that place, is when a child then starts thinking, hey, well, I might as well make the best of it. It is what it is. This is where I'm going to be. I might as well just accept it and move forward. And so when they get to resolution, they start to settle in. You see their distress level goes down. You see them start talking about the future and planning for the future, anticipating the future. And as they do that, you start to see things like they can focus and concentrate better, school goes better, and they start to just settle in and are progressing in every area of their lives. So that's how or what behaviors you see that would let you know they're grieving. Now, the when is really, we can see it just about any time. Okay? So, because we can see babies experience grief. And so it can be through any age span that a child might go through. And so as we talk about that, it's also not, as I mentioned before, grief is not like an orderly thing. It's not a, well, I went through that once, I'm all done, I never have to deal with that ever again. Grief and loss can come up at multiple developmental stages in a child's life as they start to process things at a deeper level, especially in adolescence, when the significance of their loss really starts to sink in. We see a big difference. Okay. All right, so take a couple of minutes, talk in your groups about your issue, read about it, and be ready to share it with the rest of us.
I don't read very well, so if one of you guys wants to read it.
I can read it out. Control. For children who have experienced a loss, many feel that they have had no control or decision, making power over their own lives. The adopted child or youth did not choose to lose his or her birth.
All right, guys, we need to go through these. So as we go through each group, you get the wonderful experience of talking with a mic. So, so group one, tell us about control.
Okay, so control, why the child might feel control is because they've lost everything that they've known as far as their life as they know it. They have had no say in this change that they've gone through. And so they want to gain some kind of control or feel like they're gaining some kind of control over their life. So you'll see behaviors like being orderly, compulsive, neat, needing, routine, or planning ahead. Some kids might show their need for control by the constant power struggle with authority figures, skipping school, defiance, substance abuse, or tantrums. And other kids might hide things, hoard food, develop eating disorders, or utilize more creative means to control family life. Some kids will create chaos to have some kind of control over other people in their new family or their new home. And this can happen at, I would imagine, at most stages, like beyond infancy.
Well, when infants don't get their way, what do?
Well, that's true. They
They
have a
try to
tantrum.
control their
Yeah.
environment, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and I really like, when we talk about control, because the reality is that I think I've experienced every single one of those behaviors in my home and more. And in talking about that, I've experienced hoarding, chaos, defiance, all of those things. Now, as we go on to the next issue, one of the other things that I want to point out as we talk about these is I want you to notice that with kids, it's often not just one issue happening at a time. Okay? So as we go through these, you'll notice how often issues can be interrelated. So for example, the reason the child's seeking control is because they've been removed from everything they've ever known. They're experiencing grief and loss. And you're going to see the same thing as we go through the different issues. So we're going to talk, group 2 is going to tell us about loyalty.
So, as to why the child might feel the need for loyalty, it's they've been taken away from their parents and given a new set of parents, and they didn't choose to take on this new set of parents, so they don't want their old parents or their birth parents to know that, or to think that they don't love them anymore, and so they kind of will fight you there. How they will do that, they'll kind of like distance themselves from their foster or adopted family,
Okay.
and kind of tell you, I don't have to listen to you. You're not my parents. You're not my real family, kind of things. And they'll kind of feel guilty over anything that makes them happy with their
Okay.
adoptive family. When this would happen, I think we think the older they are, the more likely they're going to feel this sense of loyalty, because they've been with their birth parents for longer, or they've been able to build up that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And they recognize at a higher level of consciousness with their brain development the difference. Very young kids will often start calling their foster parents mom and dad right away. But I mentioned to you guys, my daughter didn't call us mom and dad for 1.5 years because she was being loyal to her birth parents and because she wanted control. So that's an ongoing thing that we see happening. All right, so group 3 is going to tell us about rejection and fear of abandonment. So Dallas is the...
Thank you.
He volunteered.
Volunteered. All right. So there's a vast amount of reasons why they would feel rejected. First of all, in their homes originally with their parents, those parents might have been moving around from house to house anyway. Right. So that would give them kind of a feeling of rejectment even within the home. Outside, when they're being taken away, they might feel rejected because they're separated from their siblings. One might be older than the other. And when you're the older child and the younger ones are more available to adopt or foster, then that older child feels left out. Maybe a sister or something like that is cuter And they're like, well, I want to, I want to be taken in too. That's another form of rejection. They could have been bouncing around from foster home to foster home as well. And just in general, any of that instability is just going to give them that feeling of rejection. So how are they going to manifest their behaviors? Sometimes they might do things too well. They might be focusing on school a lot to the point where it's detrimental to their health. While the means is bad, the end is good, it doesn't mean that that's healthy, and we probably should be able to recognize that. They also might do some sort of avoidance. So if you're trying to get close to them, if you're like going to throw a birthday party or something like that for them, they might pull back a lot, and they might even react to you at that. Gifts, like in that movie with the dress or something like that, they're going to react to that because it's showing stability, and they don't want that in a lot of ways. And when, well, I think it really manifests itself at any time. I mean, even in infancy, we can see them. I mean, the behavior is a lot more subtle, even at younger ages. But at older ages, we can see the behavior manifest itself a little bit better because we're better able to understand that behavior. It's just easier to read at that point.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. But yeah, and when we talk about this with kids, we know that they just are not, they can't trust that we're going to be there for them. So often they'll try and get rid of us before we can get rid of them, right? And so, or like you said, they're going to be so good, golden, so that we won't get rid of them. But they can't do that forever. All right. Group 4 is going to tell us about self-esteem.
All right, so the why might a child feel this way is someone gave them, we're doing self-esteem. Someone gave them away, so maybe something's wrong with them. Taking it on themselves instead of, blaming themselves for what's happening, and seeing their self as being flawed. The how, what behaviors tell you how this child is feeling this issue or what is going on to show that. They choose negative influences in their life. They have a negative self-image. Fear that they actually will succeed at something and holding themselves back of that because of that. Self-harm behaviors, to just name a few. And then at what developmental stage might this surface? We thought that it could happen absolutely at a younger age, but it'd be more evident, like you guys were saying, at an older age. And it kind of depends on the mental awareness of the child, their mental age instead of their physical age, because we know that they can be different, as we've discussed. Young children will probably deal with their self-esteem by acting out. Older children will do that too, but it'll be more evident in the older children because you see other behaviors that happen with it too.
Right. Yeah, and as we talk about these 7 issues, all of them are really important. With that being said, my personal opinion is self-esteem for these kids is a huge issue. Because, and once again, this is tied into the loss they've been through. It's tied in to their fear of rejection and abandonment. So just to give you an example of this, in my home, my adopted kids have basically quit at everything they're good at. So we've had them in just about every sport you could name: football, basketball, soccer, volleyball, swim, cross country, track, mountain biking, and they quit because they can't handle the pressure that they put on themselves. that they don't believe they're enough. And it's really hard to get them past that struggle because they believe that somebody gave up on them and something must be wrong about them. And so that must mean that they aren't good. And when they start having evidence by success of being good, they seem to sabotage it.
Almost like this is too good to be true.
Right. Yeah.
Why progress or anything?
Yeah. So just one example of many I could give you. My youngest son runs cross country and track. So this year in cross country, he's a sophomore, or he was a sophomore. As of today, I guess he's now a junior. But sophomore year, second race in the year, he got first place on the team. Ran as fast as any of my other sons who have done cross country in high school as a sophomore, as fast as they were running as a senior. At the end of the season, he was running races 5 minutes slower. So that's just an example of how they can sabotage that. Not intentionally, but it just seems to happen. Okay? All right. So we're now needing to talk about trust.
So for trust, talks about how trust issues can start from early on because of maybe it's multiple moves, so they've never had that stability, so there's no consistency in their lives. And talks about many older children have a history of abuse and neglect. And when there's that neglect, it's any person who's responsible to care for them. Those people, sabotage that. They didn't take care of them, so it can become a pattern, and they don't trust. And these behaviors, the lack of trust, can be manifest at many different ages. At all the different ages, but one of the things it talks about is when they're older, they can become clingy, and they don't understand how to have a close relationship. It talks about it at younger ages. It takes them a lot longer to warm up to you. So that's one of the ways that can manifest. One of the problems that you can see also is stealing and lying. And one of the things I thought about was the examples you brought up with food. They weren't nourished, given the amount of food that they needed. So that's one of those things they don't have that trust. So it can manifest in hoarding the food and that type of behavior.
Yeah. So what age is that happening?
I would imagine that the food stuff would be happening, well, it could happen at any age really, but probably, 5 to 12, and even on up.
Definitely. Yeah, and when we talk about trust, for a lot of these kids, the kind of thought process that's happening in their head is, why should I trust you when I couldn't trust my birth parents? And, well, they placed me with this other family who said they were going to take care of me, and they didn't take care of me. And so, and then depending on the child, that may have happened multiple times. So how are you any different? In the child's mind, why should they trust you? Because their experience has been that adults in their lives are untrustworthy. And it's going to be hard to change. All right, so group 6 is going to tell us about identity.
So kind of what we've all talked about, they kind of all link, they all kind of run together here, but with identity, I think as the child starts to figure out they're different, right? They're not biological, they're the odd one in the group. I think they don't really know where they fit in. They struggle with, they may not know a lot about their birth parents or why they were taken away. There may be, they talked about there may be some secrecy that goes along with that. And so they may just be trying to fit in anywhere they can. So a lot of times in school, they'll just hang out with the wrong crowds because it's any crowd. They may become promiscuous, just trying to form, just trying to fit in anything and anyone. It talks about also that they may even try to get pregnant or have a child so that they have some sense of identity, someone that they are now linked to. Yep. And and as far as when that can happen, I mean, I think, I guess we didn't really feel like it could manifest itself a lot when they're really young, a newborn. But as soon as they start to figure out, hey, what's different about me? Why don't I look like them? Why don't I, they just, as they start to recognize that they are different, then it starts to come out.
So elementary school age, pretty much on, but then especially during the teenage years. So I've talked with you guys about this before, that 12 to 15 especially, or 12 to 16, is a huge time frame for identity. And so I want to touch on a couple of things with that just to help this sink in. So I've got a couple of things to share with you. So this first one is an essay written by a 13-year-old girl who was adopted from foster care at age 3. So at 13, she had now been with her adoptive family for longer by 3 times than her birth family. So here's her persuasive essay she wrote in school. I strongly believe that I should be able to see my birth parents before I'm 18, for these are the reasons. One of my reasons is that I've been wondering about who I look like out of my 2 parents, who I get my eye color from, my thick hair, and much more questions. Another reason is because I never get to know how much my life would be different. For example, if I ever wanted to go live with my mom and dad, my whole life would change. How would you like it if you didn't like your life that much and you could change it all? My main reason is memories. How many memories do you have with your mom and dad? How much do you value them? When you get sick, they are always by your side. When they disgust you, by having the sex talk and then talk about themselves. How they make you laugh, and most importantly, how much they love you and you love them back. So like I've said, I strongly believe that I should be able to see my birth parents before I'm 18. So what do you hear in that? Catherine?
Looking for a sense of belonging, a sense of...
Identity.
Yeah, identity.
Trying to figure out who they are. Okay? Which, by the way, this child met their birth parents and the birth parents rejected her, which at times happens, but she's got a much stronger connection now with her adoptive parents than she did at 13 because she was able to get through that. Okay?
There's also fantasy in that too.
Right, very much so. You often see with these children that they, and this is especially true with younger children because they don't remember how bad things were in their birth home. And they have this fantasy, this belief that my parents are going to come back and get me and we're going to live happily ever after. We call it the Disneyland fantasy. And so they're searching for that, but with older kids, they kind of know. When they're removed, when they're older, they know how bad it was. But there's still that grief and loss, and there's still that fear of rejection that kids go through. All right, second one. This is an article written by another girl. She came into foster care at age 5. And so she wrote this poem when she's about 12, and she titled it Wishing. It says, after 5 years of hiding and pretending, after 5 years of waiting for the darkness to swallow me up, after 5 years of being scared and tormented, after 5 years of not feeling loved enough, after 5 years thinking I wasn't good enough for anyone, after 5 years of crying hard into the dark nights, after 5 years of hatred in their eyes, after 5 years of being all alone and scared, after 5 years of not being able to talk to anyone, after 5 years of wishing and waiting, finally my family came. So that's a girl that identified at 12 years old with her birth family. But as she got older, she went through some of those same struggles with wanting to connect with her birth family rather than with her adoptive family. All right, last one. This is an article I found online several years ago. It was titled, So Happy I Had a Brother. Boys meet as friends, discover their siblings. Says, every summer Don Nolting buys her son Isaac a pool pass and drops him off to swim with his friends. In July, Isaac was hanging out when he met a friend of a friend, 13-year-old Dakota Zimmer. The kids at the pool in Washington, Missouri noticed that Isaac and Dakota looked an awful lot alike. They had the same hands, the same feet, the same nose, the same hair. They even walked alike. Someone asked if they were brothers. Dakota said he had a brother he had never met who was adopted by a woman named Dawn. That's my mom's name, Isaac said. That night, Isaac sat on the edge of his mom's bed and asked if they could talk. And his mom says, he looked at me with his big black eyes and asked, Mom, am I adopted? She said, what makes you think that? His response, because I think I found my brother. So imagine at 12 years old, finding out you have a brother that you've never known about. So those are just examples of why identity is a big deal, why it matters for these kids. We may not think about it much because we haven't maybe dealt with that issue. But one last example. So doing foster care, I have 3 biological sons that are 24, 23, and 19. And my 24-year, I'm 6'2". My 24-year-old son is 6'3". My 23-year-old son is 6'2.5", and my 19-year-old son is about 6'1.5". All around my height. Have my wife's dark brown hair. All of them have a little bit of curl to their hair that they get from my wife. And then there's my 17-year-old son, Preston. And he's about 5'9". And when we looked at the time we looked at taking in our youngest son, at that point in time, Preston was about 5'4". So we sat down, had our family meeting, talked about taking Joe into our home, and asked everybody how they felt. And Preston's response was, is he shorter than me? Because he didn't want another brother taller than him. So today, they're 6 months apart. Preston's 5'9" and Joe's about 6 foot tall. So those kind of things stick out to these kids and are a big deal. All right, we're done with our groups. So go ahead back to your regular seats, and we're going to take a break for a couple minutes, and then we'll go on. All right, so we talked about this, that element number 3 is helping children understand and manage overwhelming emotions. So we've talked about this multiple times, but I want to go back to, I mentioned that I would talk about triggers more in class 7. And so I want to talk with you about triggers. Events, situations, circumstances that happen in an adopted child's life that bring up a very powerful emotional response, trauma triggers. And so one of the challenges is that when a child gets placed in your home, you don't know what those triggers are. Okay. So we talked a little bit about them in class 4. We talked about that they can tie into any of the 5 senses, that they can tie into times of the year, things like that. So I've got, one of the things I tell families is that when you get a child placed in your home, you need to start identifying what their triggers are. So in class 6, we talked about doing our detective work. And that's part of that detective work of identifying what the child's triggers are. It would be nice when you got a placement if DCFS said, hey, here is Johnny's 50 triggers. Watch for these things. That would be really nice. You're not going to get that. Now, if you do get a child that has been in care for a long time, they may be aware of some things that they can tell you. For example, when one of our sons was placed in our home, we were told by DCFS that he absolutely hated riding in the car. And we thought, okay, well, what kid likes to ride in the car? So we didn't maybe at the time take it too seriously. But then we went on a trip to California. And let me tell you what it's like driving 75 down the freeway with a child screaming and yelling in the back seat, hitting their sibling, kicking the back of the seat, and trying to get out of the car. That's a problem. Okay. Well, so you need to start making that list, and it needs to be a conscious thing. You need to be watching for these triggers, because the kid's not going to come up and say, hey, my birthday is coming up, and I have a really hard time around my birthday because it causes me to think an awful lot about my mom. So I need help. That's not what kids do verbally, but that's what the behavior is communicating to you. That, hey, there's an issue, there's a problem that I don't know how to manage on my own. Okay? And so if you think about it, what are birthdays about? Rachel?
Celebrating your birth.
Celebrating your birth. Okay? So who was there at your birth? You and your mom for sure. There may have been some other people, but oftentimes birthdays can be hard for kids for a couple of different reasons. One, because they're thinking about their birth family, especially their birth mother. And two, because it's supposed to be a time of celebration and family get-together. So one of my older sons just had a birthday on the 21st, and we had a big cake, and we had ice cream, and everybody celebrated. Well, for an adopted child, that can also bring up maybe the trauma of a birthday, like I was told about with a girl that before she went into care for like her 4th or 5th birthday, she got a new bike for her birthday. And during her birthday celebration, her birth father got mad about something, went into a rage, got mad at her, and threw her bike in the dumpster. Okay. So when you talk about having a birthday and give her a gift, what do you think her thought is? Okay. All right. The next one listed up here is especially important. You need to know the date of your child's initial removal. That's an extremely traumatic event. And kids don't necessarily remember dates, but they remember times of the year. They remember significant events happening around the time they were removed. Well, my 2 daughters were removed on October 30th. Why does that matter? Halloween. That's Halloween. They spent Halloween in a shelter. So for the first couple of years they were in our home, they had a hard time around Halloween. Today, it's not a big deal, 15 years later, but at the start it was. And so we need to be aware of those things. Now, in addition to the date that they were removed from their birth home, I would tell you, you need to know the date of every move that child's made in foster care, because those can also be a trigger. So, just one example, because I can give you so many of them. One of our sons had 9 placements, and he was in care for 5 years prior to being with us. We were the 9th placement. So 5 years, 9 placements. What's that average out to, roughly? About 6 months every placement, roughly. Okay. So he's placed in our home as an adoptive placement. The plan was for us to adopt him. There's this small problem in Utah law. Do you know what's required before you can adopt a child? They have to be in your home for 6 months. So by the time he's been in our home 6 months, what do you think he's thinking?
I'm leaving.
Time to leave. He was counting the days of how long he'd been in our home. So we got close to a 6-month mark. We were getting ready to adopt him, and DCFS came to us and said, we think you need to wait longer and make sure he's really stable in your home before you adopt him. We want you to wait a year. How do you think that's going to work? Our 6 months goes by and he's not adopted, and all hell's going to break loose. Okay? So this is just one example of the importance of advocating for your children. So I called up the assistant regional director for DCFS and said, hey, you need to understand what's going on here. This kid is counting the days. He needs to be adopted as soon as he possibly can. So I think we adopted him at like 6 months and maybe 3 days that he'd been in our home. Okay. Dave.
Just out of curiosity, I know every case is different, but how did you plan sitting down with him and letting him know, like, hey, we would like to adopt you? How do you feel about that?
Well, so once again, with both of my boys were older kids, and so when they were placed in our home, that was discussed before placement. Especially for us, we wanted them to know this is the plan, and is it something you want? So once again, children over age 12 in foster care, the law requires them to consent to their adoption. So we were talking with them about that at placement. Now, along that line, we didn't tell him his adoption day until the day before. We had told him he had a court hearing coming up, that we had a review hearing, so he knew that that was coming because he needs to go to court with us. And the day, you know, it's like either the day or 2 days beforehand, we sat him down and said, hey, you know, you've got that court hearing coming up. What do you think about talking to DCFS and seeing if we could adopt you? And he goes, yeah. Not knowing that was the plan all along. Okay? Because often, even though these kids want that, they're often scared to death of it at the same time. So it can be very complicated. All right, we just passed Mother's Day. That wonderful annual holiday event. What's Mother's Day about? Celebrating with your mom.
Celebrate having a mom, your mom.
Yeah, which one? Because if your child is in elementary school, or if you go to church, more than likely somewhere they're making a gift for mom. Which mom do they give it to? Because of course you know that, right, that Susie's going to come home and say, hey mom, at school we're making a gift for Mother's Day and I really want to give it to my birth mom. Would you be okay with that? Right? That's what Susie's going to do, right? No. But do you think she's thinking about her birth mom? Yeah. And so Susie's likely going to start acting out, having difficulty because she can't handle this. She doesn't know what to do about this. She's dealing with loyalty issues. She's dealing with fear of abandonment and rejection issues. And so how does she deal with that? Yeah.
What is this something that you would, so like with Mother's Day, is that something you would preemptively like talk to them about? See, because you know it's going to come up?
I was hoping somebody would ask. Because yes, that's why we're talking about all these things, so that you can anticipate, so that you can preemptively plan. Yes?
What if you said, hey, let's make your mom something?
Wouldn't that be a great idea? Hey, Susie, Mother's Day's coming up, and I just know that you're thinking about your birth mom. You're wondering if she's okay. Would you like to send her a card? Would you like to do something for her for Mother's Day? And Susie may say, no, I don't want to do anything with her. But Susie may also say, yes, I really want to. But Susie also has to know it's okay for her to talk about this stuff with her adoptive mother and father. All right, now notice Father's Day is not listed up there for some reason. I don't know why. In general, though, what I've seen is it seems like more often these kids are more connected to their birth mother rather than their birth father. It's not an absolute, but generally that's what we see. So you could still have a child that Father's Day is a trigger too. Okay. Now, any holiday can be a trigger because holidays are times of family celebration, get together where we have lots of traditions, lots of things that mean a lot to us. And so for a child, that's just often a time of trigger because holidays are supposed to be times of happiness, supposed to be, but they're usually the highest stress times in our lives because we're worried about getting gifts and doing things, and it's more stressful. There's more abuse that happens around holidays, and there's more removals that happen around holidays, which means there's more chance for triggers. And by the way, starting in October, we go through the holiday season because we have Halloween, then we have Thanksgiving, then we have Christmas, then we have New Year's, then we have Valentine's Day. I could keep going. We have then after on Valentine's Day, we have the most important holiday of the year, St. Patrick's Day. How many of you decorate for St. Patrick's Day? I do. It's a big deal. And then on to Easter. Yeah, Alana.
At Christmas time one year, when we got our kids, they were 10 and 11 years old, and they were siblings, and we were living on a military base, and it was time to go Christmas shopping. And our daughter was at a friend's house, and our son was home alone, and we went Christmas shopping and came home to the security police in our yard, and our son said that a man in a black hoodie had taken a rock and thrown it through his sister's window. He was in high school, and he took one look at the security police, and they were going, uh-huh. And they knew he did it. And we didn't make a big deal of it. We just gave him a hug and realized that there was just something not right. And when we talk about this now, I'm really understanding why that happened. And it was just too much right. Stress, too much whatever. And so that's how he reacted to the Christmas time holiday.
Yep. Yeah, so just know for all of these kids that holidays can be a big deal, and for a different child, a different holiday may be a big deal, and so it's not a guarantee for every child. And the same, not every child's going to have every single one of these triggers. You have to be able to identify what they are.
And they'd been in 11 homes.
Yeah. Now, the next one is if you move. Now, moving, I don't care who you are as a child, moving's not fun. Now, it's fun for parents, right? No, not fun. But we are adults, so we're supposed to be able to handle it. Our kids all struggle with moving. I remember when I moved back to St. George, when my oldest was 13 or 14, that was a challenge. But for an adopted child, when you move, it takes on different significance, okay? Because that's a trigger for them for a couple of different reasons, at least, many reasons likely. So number one, it can be a trigger of them bouncing around in foster care. And it brings with it loss. It brings with it the loss of what's familiar to them, because you may be moving to a new town, could be a new state, new schools, new areas, everything is new, and they don't handle change very well. Okay. Now, the other reason it can be a potential trigger is for adopted children. When they were with their birth family, because of the instability, they often moved around a lot. And so, what do you think moving was like for them in their birth home? middle of the night getting evicted, losing all their stuff, you know, trying to avoid the landlord. And so often that's what these kids think moving is like. And so for them, it's not a fun event. It's very scary and traumatizing. And they really struggle with it. And not only that, but then when they get to the new area, they have to explain to people they meet why they're different. So you may be thinking, well, why do they have to explain why they're different? But that's how the child sees it, because they're adopted. And it can be especially something as significant as if you have a child that's a minority and they're adopted by a Caucasian family, then there's going to be lots of questions. Or if somebody finds out they're adopted, even if they don't look different, then they have to explain things. When I moved back to St. George with my kids, my 2 adopted daughters said they didn't want anybody to know they were adopted because they just want to fit in. Okay. Now, any kind of loss is hard for them. So that means any kind of death in the family, anything like that is really hard. But it can be even things like pets. Okay. I was training pre-service about 8 years ago in Cedar City and got a call from my wife right when my class had ended, and our dog had just got hit and killed by a car. And all of my kids were sitting on the side of the road crying. But one of my adopted children was mad at all of their other siblings because their siblings weren't as upset as they were. And literally, you would have thought that this child's birth parent had just been killed because it was that big of a deal to them. So any loss is hard to them. Losing friends, they just can't do it very well. So what that means, tied in with that, is you need to get used, if you have a spouse, you need to get really comfortable with them. Because if you're going to do this work, you're no longer allowed to get divorced. Because that's the last thing a adopted child needs, let alone your birth children. That's why I tell you to take care of yourself and take care of your marriage, because these kids don't need more losses. Okay. So I joke about that, but I'm also really serious about it. Okay. Now, transitioning from one level of school to the next, going from elementary school to middle school to high school, is hard for them to make those transitions because they don't do well with change. So we thought in Washington County that wasn't enough, so we had to add another transition. We had to throw in intermediate school because we want them to have more change. But they struggle with that adjustment, and my experience has been that they even struggle with the transition from going from school just ended to now we're going to summertime. And my adopted kids are going to struggle with that. And then when school starts again in the fall, they're going to struggle again with that because they don't do change very well. They don't do transition, so they really have a hard time. Now, medical crises. 2 reasons I'm aware of why that can be a trigger. Number 1, when you go into a doctor's office, a dentist's office, what's the first thing they have you do?
Medical history.
Say it louder.
Medical history.
Medical history. So you're bleeding all over the counter, and they want to know your medical history. Okay. Well, for your adopted child, what do you put about their medical history? Don't know. And so one of the things that I talk about with kids, with all of us really, is our life is like a puzzle. And every part of our life is a piece of that puzzle. And so for an adopted child, not knowing that medical history means a lot of pieces are missing. So they don't feel complete. They don't know everything about their identity because stuff is missing. And so that's one reason medical crises are a big thing for them, because they don't know their own history, and we don't know their history often. Which is why, once again, it's important to try and have a connection or relationship with birth parents or even extended family. Okay. Latrice.
When a child is removed, does DCFS go through a process where they try to get any previous medical history on the child?
Absolutely. They absolutely try and gather that. They're supposed to sit down with the birth parents and try and fill out a form regarding that kind of information. So what do you think the birth parent says? You've just taken my kids away. Tell me your medical history. What do you think they're saying? Go to hell, right? But they do try to do that. They work on that. So sometimes you'll get some of that information when you adopt a child.
Do they try to go through get a hold of medical records?
Yeah, there's a healthcare nurse. DCFS has a healthcare nurse in each area that all the kids, the healthcare nurse monitors that, and they try and gather any records they can access. Okay? But doesn't mean there's going to be a lot there. All right. The other reason medical crises can be a trigger, my experience has been that many of these kids have had past traumatic experiences with medical professionals. Whether that's with a dentist because their teeth weren't well cared for, so they had to have a lot of dental work when they were little, and so that was traumatic, or they've had past serious physical injuries. Whatever that is, that just seems to be a big deal. Even they often don't like therapy. One of our sons, when he was placed in our home, within 30 days of getting them into your home, you need to, with kids 5 and up, have a mental health assessment. With all kids, they need to have a physical called a well-child check. And with children over age 3, they need to have a dental exam. Well, my wife took our son into his mental health appointment, which, by the way, is about 2 hours in case you need to know it's long. 15 minutes in, my son says, "I'm sick of this crap, I'm out of here," and he walks out of the building. And in the parking lot tells my wife, "You can't make me go back in there," because of past trauma. So that's just one example of many I could give that why those things can be a trigger. Rachel.
Can I ask what your wife did in that situation?
So, okay. What can you do? You know, I mean, it's a little bit different if he's 6 years old, but at 11, can't physically force him to go. And like I said, there were reasons for that we found out later, but, you know, it's one of those things. All right. We've talked a lot about adolescence. We've talked about the fact that adolescence is a time of identity formation, of figuring out who you are. So it's often a really big trigger for these kids, because that's especially where loyalty issues can kick in really hard, where identity issues are a big deal, where these kids really struggle figuring out who they are, and they're easily influenced by their peers. They're at high risk to try drugs or alcohol. They're at high risk to engage in promiscuity, to engage in a lot of behaviors that can be very dangerous at that age as they're trying to figure out who they are. So that's common. Now, in American society, we don't have many rituals. There are some cultures that are very steeped in rituals, but I know of one ritual that happens in American society, and it's high school graduation. And that's like happening like tomorrow night, tomorrow, depending on which school you go to. So what's high school graduation about? Say it louder.
Transition
A transition to what?
to supposedly adulthood.
Yeah, you're now an adult. Congratulations. So what does that mean? A lot of unknowns. What else?
There's a lot of thanking the people that got us here. We're so grateful for our parents for getting us this far.
Yeah. And what else? With those transitions, what's the norm? What's typically expected kids will be doing? Going to college or work or a trade school, going out on their own, living their own life. Right? So, what do you think an adopted child hears when they hear that? Catherine? You're getting rid of me. So, my wife and I have joked about this for a long time because for all of our kids, we've now had 5 graduate, and we give them a present for graduation. Any guesses? Luggage. Okay. Well, that doesn't work so well for an adopted child. So, honestly, with our younger daughter who graduated 2 years ago, we didn't give her a suitcase because we knew the message she would interpret there. And so we gave her something else, even though all of our other kids have gotten luggage, because they were going off to college, they're going out on their own. So just be aware, for an adopted child, high school graduation can be a very traumatic thing. It's hard enough for regular kids because they now think they have to figure life out, but for an adopted child, it's really hard. All right, the last couple, real quick. Engagement or marriage is a trigger because they're now, it's bringing up lots of things for them. Am I going to be like my birth parents? Can I do a relationship? Why couldn't my parents do it? I'm now supposed to trust this person I'm engaged to or getting married to more so than anybody I've ever trusted in my life, and I don't trust people because when I do, they let me down. So there's lots of things going on for that child as they get to that stage. Can I make this work? So I just had an adopted child get married, and I saw this happen. It was a very stressful thing for that child. It really freaked them out going through that process. And so it can be very challenging. And then pregnancy can bring up all kinds of things like, can I be a good parent? Am I going to be like my birth parents who abused me? Or am I going to be like my adopted parents? How do I take care of a child? What's my life going to be like? And as the adopted child goes through their pregnancy, a lot of their past is going to come up that they're going to be thinking about and working through because of the trauma that they've been through and the fact that this is reminding them of that. Catherine.
Okay, so I'm just going to flip this coin for a second. The engagement or marriage and the pregnancy, what if you flipped it and it was the adopted parents that were doing that? Would it be, I mean, obviously it could be a trigger because they have seen that happen in their previous experience. Like, what would that look like for, you know what I mean? Instead of it being them getting engaged or married, pregnancy, what if it was their parent, their adopted parent?
It's often very threatening to the child because they will often be afraid of being replaced. And I can tell you, just because we've seen this as simple in our home when we had our 2 girls for like 5 years before we took another adopted placement. And both of my daughters were very threatened by taking in our son because they were worried about being replaced. And so that's very common when a parent of an adopted child either remarries or has another child. It's a big threat to that adopted child. And you know, and that's true of all kids. They struggle through that, but it's much more intense for an adopted child. Yeah.
I've been going through like this engagement marriage thing, and I, you know, from the FLES, I didn't have like dating experience or anything, but I was legally adopted.
Yeah.
After I left, so I have, and then my biological father was kicked out of the church, and so now I have 2 dads. And my father came to me like, "Can I give you away?" You know, and my wedding's like coming up June 3rd, and I was like, "Yeah, you know." He's like, "What about the other dad?" I'm like, "Well, you're the one that, you know, was with me all my childhood." So I went to my other father, and I'm like, "You know," I says, "You know, I already asked it, my biological, and I said, would you want to stand up there because my mom's going to be doing the ceremony because she has the license and everything. Do you want to stand with her?" And he says, "I'm glad you're saying that because I'm not giving you away."
Right.
Well, that was interesting. Well, it worked
Yeah.
out, but.
And it makes things complicated more so than most kids have to deal with.
Yeah.
And so, which these kids often aren't equipped to handle difficult things, and they're now have to. Okay. All right. The last 2, midlife crisis. All of us go through a time where we're dealing with that. I don't want to shock anybody, but it happens midlife where you start reevaluating your life. You're wondering if you've accomplished everything you wanted to accomplish. If your life has purpose and meaning. That's why people make bucket lists. That's why people do crazy stuff. Who in here has a sports car? Nobody's there yet, huh? Not yet, but I'm not a sports car guy. You'll know I'm there when I have a Jeep Wrangler 4-door out there. Okay, that's when I'm there. But we're trying to reevaluate that, and then life takes on importance because we start to realize we're not going to live forever. And life takes on more purpose because we want to make sure we fit it all in. And as we reevaluate everything, well, for an adopted child, reevaluating everything means reevaluating their past trauma as well. And so it can be a trigger for them about their past. And then finally, death of an adopted parent. Obviously, that's a huge loss. As they go through that, it's going to bring trauma. They're going to feel overwhelmed because that's been their one consistent person that's helped everything get better, that's helped them get past that trauma, that's provided that support and nurturing, and now they're gone. And where do they turn for that support now? Okay. So those are just examples of some triggers. That's not an absolute list by any means, but those are common triggers that we see with care. All right, if you look on page 113 in your manual, you'll see a handout that talks about the continuum of development of adopted children. So there are some common things that happen for children at different ages who are adopted. So the first age is 0 to 3, and at 0 to 3, kids really don't know what adoption is. They don't know that they're adopted, and that means that's a great time to start talking about it. Okay? So Sean asked me at the break about that. When do we start talking to kids about being adopted? The answer to that question is as soon as we know that's the plan. So obviously when reunification is happening, we don't say to the child, hey, we're going to adopt you. But once we know that adoption is the plan, that conversation should start, and a child should never remember a time when they didn't know about that information. Okay. Now, I think I passed around before, did I pass around the life books, examples of life books? So with young children, that's one of the best ways to do that because it's very simplified and it helps them understand the difference between a birth parent and an adoptive parent. So that as they get older, that's already, to them, that's just normal. Sean.
So what happens if you adopt a child, let's say at 1 year old? So at 3 years old, you start saying, hey, by the way, we adopted you 2 years ago?
You make a life book for them when they're 1 year old so that as they get older, you're showing them that life book from the start. So they just always know about that. Okay? Most parents are taking pictures at their adoption. And so you can talk about those stories. So I can tell you, my youngest son, Joe, was adopted on August 18th, 2014. So 3 years ago in August. And so I have that picture on my phone of him at his adoption. And so you incorporate those kind of things into that life book. And so you just use that at a young age for that conversation or just for the child to look at. Okay? Because they don't know the difference. And so that's a time to collect information. It's a time to reassure the child that they will not lose you as an adoptive home. Young children, you know, my birth children, when they were in the next age range, which is the 3 to 7, they loved to hear about their birth and their first couple years. So my wife has scrapbooks for all of our kids, my birth children, at birth. Well, with my adopted children, we can't really do that. We have scrapbooks that start at placement. And so, you know, if you adopt a young child, they love hearing about their adoption story. When they're in this next age range, they like hearing about that, talking about it. And so you need to take that opportunity because they're not always going to want to talk about it. Okay? So this age range is a good time to encourage them to ask any questions, to share their story, to establish boundaries and limits, those kind of things. But let them know that you'll always be willing to talk to them because as they get older, their desire to know that information will disappear. Okay. The next age range, 8 to 12, are kids that are starting to realize at a deeper level the loss that they've been through, to realize that that means if they have adoptive parents, that means somebody got rid of them. Okay. And so for your adopted child, they're grieving at a deeper level. There's often a big sense of denial as they go through this stage. They don't want to talk about it because they're not really able to handle the emotion. So we need to have built that foundation before this age range. And then finally, the last age, 12 to 15, they're really angry at this point because they're going through identity. They're upset about being adopted. And most often, they're taking their anger out on you as the adoptive parents because they can't really take it out on their birth parents. And so when they're upset at this age, don't let it get to you. This is not about you. The child is grieving as they're going through this, and they're trying to figure out where they fit in and who they are. And then finally, 16 to 19 is a time where they tend to get pretty depressed because they're getting close to resolution. They're getting close to accepting this at a deeper level. but they just have a hard time with where they're at and what's going on. So we need to be just there for them, but not force the conversation, but let them know that if they ever want to talk about it and work through it, that we're there to help them out. So that's some of the basics at those ages. Any thoughts or questions about those different stages? Catherine.
I do have to say that the kids at the center that I work at, one thing that they really have is like a prized possession, because they don't have a whole lot of possessions, are those pictures.
Yeah.
The kids will, when they get really acquainted with you, they'll pull out the pictures and say, hey, this is my family.
Yeah.
And they'll show those people to you. And a thought popped up in my head, when you make a life book, I was thinking this might be a good idea. The pictures of their family, to maybe, instead of gluing them in, put them in sleeves so that they can take them out and carry them in their pocket or their wallet if they want to, as like a comfort or something to...
Yeah, we've talked about that before, because that's like a transitional item for them to help them maintain connection wherever they're at. So those kind of things can be very powerful. So my kids all have those kind of things that are important to them for whatever reason. So, my older son, when he was placed with us, he asked about getting he played Little League football, and he asked about getting his football jersey from his previous placement because it didn't come with him, and some other stuff. So we asked about that and never got it. We adopted him, and like a year and a half later, I was setting up training in this room, and in walks the caseworker with a box of his stuff. And that stuff still is important to him. He may not look at it as much now, but it's important. We also have contact with his birth grandparents. And so at his 12th birthday in our home, they came over and they gave him a scrapbook with birth pictures, with pictures of him as a little child. That's the only one of our kids that has any of those things. Those things are important to him. And so, siblings are important. All those things are really critical for these kids in their lives. Okay. All right. We're at a break for a couple of minutes, and my daughter Carly should be here shortly to talk to you guys. So we're going to take a break, and we'll go on after that. All right, guys, time to get started again. So, as I mentioned, my daughter Carly is here to talk to you, and so I'm going to turn some time over to her, and Carly's going to tell you about her story, some of her experiences, and then we'll leave some time for you guys to ask her some questions as well. So it's all yours, Carly.
Hi. This is like way more official. I've never worn this before. So it's like kind of stressing me out a little bit. I was adopted when I was 9 years old. And those first 9 years of my life were like not good at all. I don't have very many good memories. There wasn't like laughing or like happiness. My like one good memory I have is running through the sprinklers, which is kind of like something that kids do all the time. And so it's not really that big of a deal to people, but it was really fun for me to run through the sprinklers. But my birth parents weren't married. They had 7 children. They did all sorts of drugs. They sold drugs. They made drugs in the house. And it was pretty scary all the time. And then people would come into our house all the time, and like obviously they would buy drugs, but they would do every possible abuse to us that you could possibly think of. And so for a long time I was scared of windows, because a lot of people would come through our windows and hurt us, and so that was pretty terrifying. And so for the first couple I don't know, years I lived with the Farnsworths, I like refused to sleep by a window. And we had like alarms on the windows, like make sure that no one could come in. And I don't know what else. It was just super scary. And so when I came into the Farnsworths, it was like, it was super hard. And even though it was safe and I had people that were protecting me and I had people that were telling me that they loved me every single day, it was terrifying too, because like the abuse and neglect and scary stuff had become like my normal. And so going to something completely different was terrifying, and I didn't know what to do. And I already had a family, and so I didn't need them. And for lots of years, I like hated them and didn't treat them very well at all. I was kind of a little witch all the time. But so I guess, so for the first year and a half I lived with them, I didn't call Tressie my mom. Like I called her Tressie all the time, and I like of course had to do it like in the most annoying Tressie, like whiny voice all the time, and she got really annoyed with it. And I called him Cliff all the time, wouldn't call them mom and dad. Because I already had my own mom and dad. I don't care if they were like super scary and they hurt me all the time. They were my parents. And so it took about a year and a half before I was able to call them mom and dad. My mom pulled out the adoption papers and like explained everything to me, and I was like, okay, I guess I'll call you mom now. And then I like went off and did some other things. I don't know exactly what I did. But before I started calling them mom and dad, I would always ask them to like go play outside or go watch a movie or play on the computer or something. And my mom would say, well, Tressie says no, but mom would say yes. And I would be like, okay. And so I'd go upstairs and like I lived in my room because I would not call her mom. I don't know what else to share. Even after I like decided to call them mom and decided that they could like sort of be my parents, I still didn't treat them like they were my parents. I still didn't like them very much. I didn't like my siblings. They had 3 boys when I was placed in their homes, and didn't like them. They weren't my brothers. I already had my brothers. I already had a sister that I liked, so I didn't need them. And finally, lots of years later, I decided that they were my family and that I should probably treat them like I actually liked them. And now my brothers are like my best friends, and we hang out all the time and do things together. And I don't hate them. Yeah, I don't know what else you want me to tell you.
Birth siblings?
What?
Birth
Oh, yeah.
siblings.
So I have 6 birth siblings. I have a twin brother. He lives here now. He actually lives in St. George now. And then my oldest brother lives in Cedar, and then I have 3 younger siblings who live with Tressie Farnsworth's brother, and so they're like my cousins now. And so it's really nice that we still all communicate. And like for my sister's wedding 2 weeks ago, the 3 younger ones came from Oregon, and my 2 brothers came, and we all got to see each other. That was the first time we've been together, like all of us together, in a really long time. And I don't know. I don't have like the best relationship with my twin brother. My relationship is really good with my older brother and my younger siblings. We get along fine. But with my twin, it's like awkward. You would think that like it would be a little bit better, but we're 2 completely different people. He has chosen to like do things that I would never do in my life. And I have chosen completely different things. And so we kind of bash heads and like are complete opposite and don't get along. But I still love him, and I try to be friends with him. But I was placed in the Farnsworths with my sister, and that was really good to be with her, because it was some sort of normal in the the family that we're thrown into. And so that helped. and keeping in contact with my siblings. At first, it was hard to talk to them and to like have all of those memories of the abuse like dredged up. But now we're good, and I can talk to them without like having a panic attack and like remembering all the scary stuff. But, I don't know.
How about your birth parents?
I don't talk to them. They're scary. I don't know. What do you want me to tell about them?
Have you contacted them?
I have contacted them. Not a good idea. I was senior. I think I was a senior or just graduated. And my oldest brother, he contacted my parents, and at first he was like, this is so cool. Like, our birth dad is so nice. And I was like, what? I don't remember them being cool at all. But he like enjoyed it for a hot second, and then it all exploded in his face. And he just didn't have a good experience. They lied to him. They told him that everything that he remembers was a lie, and that like his therapist and his parents all fed him these things, and now he's created new memories of them, and like it was, yeah. So I was like, I'm never going to contact them. That's horrible. And then of course I'm like, actually I will. And so I found them on Facebook, and I think my dad's a creep, so I would never want to talk to him ever again in my life. But my mom, I was like, okay, I'll contact her. And so I sent her like a Facebook message, and she didn't respond for like a really long time, but she like pulled pictures off of my Facebook and put them on hers, and like wrote this huge thing about how beautiful I am and what a great girl she has. And I was like, girl, like, you can't do that. Anyway, so she like didn't like respond to me, but she like mentioned me in like her posts, and it was really awkward, and I didn't understand what was going on. So I messaged her again, and finally she responded, and she said the same thing to me that she said to Rick, my older brother, that the Farnsworths had fed me lies, and that my therapist had created all these memories for me, so I think that they're the bad guys. And I was like 7 or 8 when I was taken away from the family, so my memories are pretty in there, so I know that they are true. And so that wasn't very good, and she like continued to tell me like she wanted to gain my trust and blah 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 blah, and it was really obnoxious. And so anyway, so she's like, is there anything I can do for you? And I was like, yeah, I just want pictures. I have no pictures of me from when I was younger. And so I asked like a simple question that maybe she could possibly do, and so she was like, yeah, I'll get back to you. And like 2 months went by, and she hadn't said anything. And so like I got on, and I was like trying to be happy about it. And I was like, how's the picture hunting going? And she didn't respond for a long time. And then she just started like saying all these lies and just more stuff about how we'd been lied to. And so I wrote back some really long message telling her that if she wanted to gain my trust, she wasn't gaining it by doing what she was doing. And that she had, I think I gave her like 3 weeks to respond to my message with the truth or something. It was like kind of dramatic now that I'm like thinking about it. Or I would just like stop talking to her, and I would delete my Facebook, and 3 weeks came by, and she hadn't responded. So I was like, okay, I'll wait another week. And she hadn't responded. So I deleted my Facebook and like never thought about it again, and don't want to contact her again. And yeah, never ever want to contact my dad. He's kind of creepy. But then my sister, both of my younger sisters now have contacted my birth parents, and I don't know if they're still in contact with them, but their lives like spiral out of control when they talk to them, and mine like went downhill when I talked to them. And so anyway, I would not recommend that for like in my situation. But I don't know what other kids do when they contact their parents. So
how about extended birth
family? I have an aunt that we still talk to. She's my birth dad's sister, and she took us in for a year-ish after we were taken away from our parents, and she's awesome. We still talk to her. She took us out to get manicures and pedicures last week, and like we went out to eat and had a good time. It's a little bit weird, just because it's kind of like walking on eggshells when we're like all together, because like we don't know what we can talk about without like setting the other person off, and so it's always a little bit weird. But we have a good relationship with them. I don't talk to anybody else in my birth family but those people. So. Any questions? Ask all the questions you want.
Do your birth parents still live together?
I don't know. No, they don't. My birth dad was married a second time. Actually, it was his first time being married. He got married and then like a couple months later was put in prison for having a meth lab in his apartment. So I don't know what he's doing now. That was a while ago. And then my birth mom they both live in Salt Lake. But I don't know if they talk to each other. I don't know if anything really about them besides that they both have been in and out of jail lots of times since we were placed with the Farnsworths.
How do you feel about your life now?
Like I'm living right now? I feel good. I don't know.
Of the stuff that you've been through, like with the Farnsworths, and to where you're at right now, do you have gratitude and you're excited and happy that this happened to you?
Yes.
I have 2 foster adopt kids, and they're really glad that they were adopted.
Yeah, I am too. I just imagine like what my life would be like. I have a biological cousin who I guess we were like friends when I lived with my birth parents. I don't remember her very well, but my older brother does, and he like tells me about her life, and like she's like a prostitute and like been in and out of jail, and she's his age, she's 23, and just like been to jail so many times and like just not a good life. And so I'm like super grateful that they like adopted us. And even after I'm not kidding when I tell you I treated them horrible, like super bad, and they still kept me. And so I'm super grateful for that. And I served a mission. He probably told you all of this. I graduated high school, which was like a super accomplishment because people told them that I would like never graduate. So that was awesome. And then I went on a mission. Now I am going to Dixie, and I'm like teaching at preschool. Like I'm loving my life right now. I wouldn't have any of that if I wasn't adopted.
On the Student Alumni Association.
I'm on the Student Alumni Association at the college. So yeah, it's good.
So what helped you, I guess, I'm sure it's a process, but heal? I mean, was it the consistency, the Farnsworth, the love and support? Was it a combination of therapists? What was the kind of, what kind of brought you out of where you were at?
I had like 10 different therapists. I went to therapy pretty much more than half of my life. And so I had tons of therapists. And at the beginning, most of them were like, oh, she's too young. She's a 7-year-old girl. Like, let's not make her talk about anything. She's so sweet. Let's let her play and give her toys. And so that wasn't really helpful. And then I went into a residential treatment center and for 11 months. And that was awful. My therapy, like we didn't touch on anything that was like that helped at all. I like came out with more problems than I had before. Like I had an eating disorder after, and like they convinced me that I was like anorexic. Like it was awful. And obviously not all like treatment centers are like that. But then I came home and had some more therapy. And then finally my last therapist, she was a lot more like firm than any of the other therapists, but he also came into every single session And it was probably the worst year of therapy I've ever had in my entire life, but it was the most helpful. It was the hardest and like scariest, and like curled up in the ball crying every day, like therapy, but it was the best therapy and the most like healing that I have had. And it was also a combination of just like the consistency and the love, that even though I treated them horrible and like called them all sorts of names and threatened to like kill them, like all of these things, they still were like, we love you. We're never gonna give you away. So, yeah, I don't know.
I just want to commend you for coming in today. I mean, I think this is awesome that you're doing this. But I have another question.
Go for it.
When you run into someone else that has this kind of same background that you do, what kind of advice do you give to that person, or what would you say to that person? I don't know if you've ever had that.
I don't know. I don't think I've ever.
Let me translate that for you real quick, because then she'll relate. When your younger brothers make stupid choices, what do you say to them?
I hate you. I'm just kidding. I don't say that. I can't believe I just said that. I don't know. I don't know what I would say. They're annoying. I don't know. That's probably not the best.
It's a tough question.
What have you said to Preston when he's acting out?
I don't know. I don't remember. Stop being dumb.
Grow up. Get it together.
Oh,
Stop acting like a dork.
I just feel like especially with my brothers, like they have the skills. I just said that word. They have the skills to like be in control and to figure their lives out, but they just don't use them. And I don't know. Like I don't know. You probably are going to help the kids out. I don't know, tell them things. So I didn't listen to like pretty much anything they told me when I first lived with them for a long time. And they'd be like, this will help. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's not going to help. Anyway, but now I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess that would help. So just like listening and like actually trying it. Like I wasn't going to try anything. I didn't want to try anything that they told me to do. So like actually just like take a chance. I don't know, try something new. I don't know.
Was there something like, so you said how you like acted out and you didn't really want to listen to anything they had to say or anything. Was there like in the back of your 5-year-old mind, was there something that you were wanting them to do, or was it just strictly, you didn't associate them with your parents, so you just wanted nothing to do with it? There wasn't something you wanted that you wanted for?
I think part of it was that they were my parents, and then the other part was to see if they would actually like keep me, like they would actually love me like they said they would, because I didn't believe it. I was like, if I act bad enough, you'll give me away. But obviously they didn't, which is good. So, yeah.
You kind of talked about how in the beginning you treated your parents like horribly, and then like when they started talking about adoption, they first called them mom and dad, and how just that attachment formed was because of that like sense of permanency. But then also like how you said like, oh, you started like meshing with your like adopted siblings. Like was there something concrete that helped that process, or was it just enough time in your healing your own like emotional journey? Was there something that helped facilitate that attachment?
I think a lot of it was just time, and like I had to figure out like me, which I don't know, because like growing up I was told that like all these horrible things about myself, that I was horrible, that I was ugly, that no one loves me, that I'm worthless. Anyway, so I had to figure out like who I was, but also we lived in like Tooele, like close to Salt Lake, and we like just moved. Like we didn't even know we were moving until 3 days before we moved. We didn't know where we were moving, and we just like moved so we couldn't have any contact my parents are super creepy, guys. Not these ones, but my biological parents. Yeah. Yeah. When we lived in Tooele, they would come to our like window in like our house, our school, and they would like come and talk to us. And like they're super creepy. And so we just moved to St. George, and I think that helped a lot because we didn't know anybody here, and so I had to like be friends with my brothers. I like went to school, the same school with my brother, and we didn't know anyone, so I had to like sit next to him and talk to him on the bus, and like we like had to be friends. Yeah, I don't know, just time, I think, and accepting like that this was my family and that they actually like did care about me.
When you have tough moments now, or maybe something that has triggered you, do you have methods, or do you recognize that that's happening and then you are able to kind of fix it?
Mm-hmm. So just like a couple weeks ago, I had like woken up, and we read scriptures early in the morning, and so I like came upstairs and I had my blanket over my head, and I was waiting for everybody to come to the table so we could read, and he came up behind me and just like poked me, which is like what he does like every day. And so I should have like expected it, and I did expect it, but I like jumped down his throat and like punched him. I got so mad. Obviously, like I didn't punch very hard because I'm like weak, but it didn't hurt him. But I was so mad, and I like for a second I was like, what just happened? Like, why did I do that? And then I was like, oh yeah, like I had a dream about my birth dad, and it was creepy. Like I was so scared, and then I like realized, and so then like I don't know, an hour later, I was like, hey Dad, you know how I like freaked out at you this morning? Yeah. And then I like had to explain to him, and just like, I don't think he even told me, like, he didn't like give me all his therapy talk. He was just like, oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. I just like, the faster I like recognize that I've been triggered, or that like I like have had a dream, like the faster that I go to my parents and say, hey, this is what happened, like even if they don't give me like therapy, then I like feel a lot better just like having it out there. When I was on my mission, it was like my second week on my mission, so it was like super stressful, and I had to talk to people, and I don't like talking to people, so I'm like shaking up here. I don't like walking up and talking to people, and it was just like super scary. But we were walking on this side of the sidewalk, and someone was walking over here, and he looked like exactly like my birth dad, and I like panicked for a second, but I was like, I'm on a mission, I'm so tough, I'm not gonna let my companion know, and like just like went on my day. And that night I had like a super scary dream again, and I didn't sleep very well, and I woke up the next morning, and like it just wasn't a good day, and my companion was like, what is going on with you? And so then I was like told her what happened, and she's like, why did you tell me before? She was so like cool about it, and she doesn't have like, I don't know, she's not a therapist, and like doesn't know me, and has never had kids before, but just telling somebody like calmed me down a little bit. But I have a lot of times where like smells are super weird to me. I'll smell something and I'll be like like panic, and I don't know why. I don't like have a memory associated with it. It just like I just panic. Or like going to like Salt Lake area, like what is it, Sugar House? Murray area, like not even like pain. I just will like feel like anxiety, like be in the car with my parents and like I can't breathe just because I'm in the area. And then I like have to talk myself down, like it's okay, like you're safe in the car with your parents, like they're not gonna just drop you off on the side of the road. Like anyway, so I have to like talk to myself a lot, which that helps. I'm not crazy, but I talk to myself a lot. He does wear it a lot. It is his work color. I don't know what his favorite color is. Blue? Red? I don't know.
He's just trying to harass me.
Any other questions?
This is the last chance, guys.
So if I'm asking this because I'm a single person, if you had gone into a family with a single parent, it wouldn't have been the same, but do you think that that would have been acceptable to you? Like, what would that have invoked in your mind, in your life?
I'm not really sure. I don't know, just as long as someone like loved me and like treated me good, I don't know if it would have made like a huge difference. I don't know. I don't really know.
Having that father figure, but at the same time you find father figures in other people, so.
Yeah, I don't think it would make such like a huge difference. I don't know. But I didn't like, my birth dad wasn't around much anyway, and when he did come around, it was to like beat my mom or to like abuse us, and so
Was a male figure more of a trigger for you in some senses?
yes, yeah. So I guess it just depends on like the kids. I don't know.
It depends on their experience. Period,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So I don't know. Like hugging my dad at first, I was like, don't touch me. So.
So do you have any apprehensions about the future as far as marriage, having
Oh my gosh.
kids?
Yeah. Yeah. I completely honest here, like boys are terrifying. Like men are so scary. The idea of like someone like touching me like all the time, no, like I can't handle that. Or like this is like way too much information, but like I was sexually abused, and so the idea of like being in that kind of relationship with a man is like terrifying. So, and like, yeah, I don't know, it's scary. Maybe someday I'll get over it. But I haven't even tried right now. Like, haven't even tried like being in a relationship or anything. I'm like, actually, boys, you should stay over there. I'll be friends, but nothing else. So, anyway.
Is there anything specific that the Farnsworths did when you were having these triggers growing up in their home that maybe made a bigger difference than other things to help you work through it?
My dad always did this thing where he'd make us stand in the mirror and say, I don't even remember it anymore. I'm of worth and value, I matter. And obviously you can tell I really love it. But no, yeah, we would have to like 3 times say it. Just because when like I had those triggers, it always went back to I'm a horrible person and all these horrible things happened to me because I was so bad and because I made bad choices and my parents hated me. And so having to stand in front of the mirror and like say that, hey, like someone loves me, that helped a lot. Even though at the time I was like, I hate that. But I still remember it from like years ago, so.
All right.
When you were initially placed, how hard was it to be separated from your siblings? Like, how long did it take before that felt somewhat normal? Did you think about your other sibling besides your sister a lot? Or?
When we were first placed with the Farnsworths, the 4 older kids all came together. And then my 2 brothers went to their best friends. And like they didn't live close, but it was a little bit easier knowing that they were like, that we could talk to each other if we wanted to. But it was still super hard. And my 2 youngest siblings were born after we were with the Farnsworths, but the 3rd youngest, she like lived with my birth parents, and I was the one who mainly took care of her, changed her diapers, fed her, all of this stuff. And so it was like super hard to like be separated from her, even though I was like a 7-year-old girl and I was like, that's my baby. Like, and even like sometimes today I'm like wanted to like mama all my like siblings, even though like we're all adults. I'm like, okay, let me be your mom. But so I thought about them a lot, but it was like also a super big trigger to be with them. Which I don't know if that makes any sense. But I don't know if that answered your question either. Also, you have a Royals, Kansas City. I served my mission there. So I kind of love the hat.
Missouri or Kansas?
Both. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Did you ever serve in Excelsior Springs?
No, but close. I served in like Kearney. So, yep. What? That's so cool.
Question. So what's your impression of the foster care system from a kid's perspective?
So I was placed with my aunt and then into the Farnsworths, and so I didn't have like a whole like actually going into like different homes. I feel like I'm super lucky because I didn't have to do that. I mean, it was still hard and like being thrown into someone else's house and being expected to love them and to do chores and to go to church and to do all these things that they already do. It's like really hard to just do that. And they did like a really good job at like you don't have to go to church, but we like to go to church as a family. They didn't like make us do anything that we didn't want to do, but it was like still hard. We like could do whatever we wanted when we lived with our parents and our aunt, and then being thrown somewhere and being expected to live like them and love them was hard. And I don't know, my like 2 brothers that were just adopted were in a lot of different homes, and I've seen how that has affected them. And I definitely would suggest like if you like can keep the kid in your house, keep the kid in your house, because the effect that it's had on them is awful. They've had like I don't know exactly their story, but from what they've said, like they have more problems from being passed around from house to house than they do from what they lived in before. So.
Okay, any last questions before we wrap it up?
Go for it.
So what was your initial feeling when you were first taken away from your parents? Because you were scared of them, but at the same time you loved them.
Yeah. I like have this weird thing in my brain where I have like created like these fantasy like memories to make things not seem as like awful as they were. So I don't remember like DCFS coming and like taking us the way that it actually happened. Like in my brain, my uncle, who's also a creep, called DCFS and was like, these kids are horrible, blah, 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 take these kids away. And I just have this memory of this van coming up and there we go. And that is like not how it happened at all, but that's how I remember it. And but we like were found in a park. We lived in a park like a lot, like in the slides and all that stuff, like not very good. Like we didn't have a house a lot. So we were like running from DCFS and they found us in a park. And I don't know what happened. I don't remember any of that, but what was your, I don't even know what your question was anymore. I'm the worst.
Was the feeling of getting removed from the abusive parents?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so I don't remember like being removed, but I just remember still being afraid. It was a different afraid and like a different uncertainty than it was when I lived with them. But I wanted to go back to what I knew because that had become like comfortable and this wasn't comfortable anymore and it was scary. And I didn't like want someone to love me. So, and I had been convinced that I was like this horrible person because they told me every single day that I was worthless and that I like had done something wrong. And so I was like, nobody can love me because I'm horrible. So I want to go back somewhere else. So.
Okay, last question. Going once. All right,
Sold.
well, I think we're done then. So thank you,
Perfect.
Carly.
Oh, stressful. take this off. I don't know how to turn it off.
All right. All right, so going on from there, the last part tonight, we're going to talk about the impact that foster care can have on families. And so we're going to talk about some of the long-term issues parents have in working with adopted children. Talk about why, I've already talked about this some, but why it's so important that children know their histories, and to know what resources and supports are there for you even after adoption. And we're going to talk a little bit about what are also called adoption subsidies. So when we talk about families that are looking at doing adoption, there are issues that we need to be aware of. And we've talked about some of these before. But when we talk about adoption, there are issues for us as caregivers. So I've mentioned to you before that you need to take care of yourself, that you need to resolve your own stuff so it doesn't get in the way of doing foster care. So I want to talk about some of the things that come up for adoptive parents, and I'm going to kind of shut this front light down so you can see them better. And so in talking about that, the first issue I wanted to mention was infertility. So many couples come into foster care and they look at doing foster care as a way to have a family because they're not able to have their own kids. And that's a good thing. As long as you've dealt with the infertility issues in your life, because infertility brings up a lot of grief and loss that people need to work through and understand how that's impacting their lives. And so you need to work through the loss that you're experiencing as a parent or as a person so that you're not letting that get in the way, because if you're taking in this child you're hoping to adopt and then they go back home, that can create some difficulty. We've talked a lot about sibling issues. We've talked about how for children in foster care and for adopted children that they either will take all of your time and attention, or as Carly said, they may not want anything to do with you and reject you. Meanwhile, your own birth children are not getting attention and they're upset with your adopted child because of the way your adopted child's treating you. So you need to work through those issues and make sure you're addressing them in your home. We've talked a lot about control. The fact that for the child, there's a lot of control issues where they struggle with feeling control in what's happening in their own lives. But then for you too, there can be control issues around maybe you don't want Johnny to go back with his birth parents and you have no control over that. Or maybe you get a child you've adopted who doesn't love and appreciate you and are thankful for everything that you've done, and they make sure to let you know that. Okay. We also need to deal with unmet expectations. So, how long did Carly say that she treated us poorly?
Long time.
Years. So, if you're expecting this child to love and appreciate you and thank you for all the wonderful things you're doing, often that's not going to happen. And not only that, but when you take this child in and you expect them to have a wonderful life and they're not living up to what you expect of them, which can be an impossible standard, that can be a problem. So you need to deal with your own stuff and not let that get in the way. So we've talked in class 5 about birth parents and the concern, the fear that's there around birth parents, which, as I mentioned in class 5, I can't say that nothing crazy ever happens with birth parents because I have experienced it. But I can tell you it's not the norm. I can tell you that my experiences are not the typical experiences with an adoptive parent. Okay? And because I can bring families in that can tell you about that they have regular contact with birth parents, and that's a very positive thing in their lives and for the life of their child. Okay? So maybe you guys are different, but most parents, when they have a child, they have dreams. They have expectations, hopes of what their child will accomplish. So maybe for you, as the dad, you played football in high school. And so your goal is for your son to play football, and he's going to be the quarterback. And then he decides he hates football. Or maybe you were a sterling scholar and you were very academically inclined and you expect all your kids to get perfect grades, and your child doesn't live up to that. That's a problem. You can't put your dreams on your child. They need to find their own dreams. Okay? And then I can guarantee if you do foster care for very long, at some point in time, you're going to feel like you screwed up. I already told you that earlier. You're going to feel like you made mistakes. You got to let that stuff go. And that's true of all of us as parents. Sometimes we feel like as regular parents we screwed up. But it's on a different level with these kids because they throw a lot more stuff at you that you have to be prepared for and be able to handle. And so you can't let it get to you. And as I talked about in class 6, you got to forgive yourself and move on. Alana.
When our son graduated from high school, he at one point got mad at us after graduation, and he turned to us and said, "You just gotta face facts. I've moved on and you're boring." And he went out the door. And I'm thinking to myself, well, don't let the door hit you in the butt as you go out. But we just let him go, and for about 3.5 years he was in our life but not in our life. He tried to have me arrested. I mean, there were lots of things that went on, but we have a really good relationship now, you know, because I think at one point he was shocked that we would take him back after he went totally haywire, because he went into drugs, alcohol, everything. And, you know, our whole idea has been, when Cliff was saying, you just can't have expectations. If you don't have expectations, you're not going to be disappointed, but you're also going to let them know that you're going to accept them for who they are, where they are, and let them be who they are. And that part is really, really hard, because you love them, you want the best for them, and they don't always want the best for themselves, and oftentimes they sabotage themselves over and over again. So it's just learning to love them where they're at and cheerlead for them. And now when our son calls, he calls almost every day and says, "Love you, Mom," and we just accept him where he's at, what he's doing, and it's been great. So you can have good too.
Absolutely. And then the last issue to be aware of is isolation. Because if you try and talk with your family and friends about the challenges that you might experience with a child in foster care or an adopted child, you hear things like, why are you doing this? Why don't you give them back? Well, why are you putting up with that? And many other things. And so the average person doesn't understand the challenges of being a foster parent or an adopted parent. And that is why, when we talk about this, that you need to connect with other foster and adoptive families. So when I talk to another foster adoptive parent about my experiences, what I see is they start shaking their head like, yeah, been there, I get that. And so it validates for you that, first of all, you're not alone. And secondly, that these experiences are pretty typical of doing this work. And so it's just different from the average person. So you need to get support from people who understand what you're going through. So that's why I've mentioned a little bit about the cluster meetings. In Class 8, we'll talk more about those and how important they are and how you get information about those. But you need that support as a foster and adoptive parent, along with other supports that we're going to talk about. So, one of the things that you need to do is you need to have some strategies. And so, there's a couple things that I want to touch on that are in your books, just so that you're aware of. So the first thing is on page 116, you're going to see a list of questions for adoptive parents to ask. So, because one of the things that we need when we adopt children is information. So prior to your adoption, you have the right to get all the information DCFS knows about the child. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But then on page 118, you'll see a handout that talks about appropriate adoption terminology, positive and negative terminology, because you hear people say things like, well, are you her real parents? Well, what's a real parent? Okay. Or how many of these are your real children? Okay. Or, you know, this is my own child. Okay. So we need to use the correct, appropriate terminology when we talk about adoption, and correct people when they use the wrong terminology. All right, on page 120, there's a list of survival skills or strategies for parents that I want to go through. So first is to acknowledge the child's grief and let them understand you've had loss too. Because you want to let kids know that loss is true of all of us in life. All of us have been through loss. Our losses may be different, but that's a typical part of life. And so kids need to understand that as they go through this process, because then it normalizes it for them that part of life is experiencing loss. The second strategy is, as I was saying, network and connect with other adoptive families to avoid that sense of isolation that you may experience. Because you can get ideas from other people. You may experience something new that you've never been through, but I guarantee somebody else has been through something like that before. Okay? And so you need to find those connections in any way that you can. When problems happen, you need to kind of keep an even keel. So what that means is we don't overreact and go overboard when a problem happens. And we don't underreact when something happens. And so we have to find that balance, because sometimes we don't really know. When my adopted kids engage in a behavior, I find I'm often asking the question, okay, well, is this an adoption issue? Is this because of past trauma that they've been through? Or is this just typical behavior for a child? And sometimes it may be hard to figure that out. So, for example, I have 3 birth sons. So for me, it's a little bit easier when one of my adopted sons has a problem and acts out. It's easier for me to differentiate between typical boy behavior and other issues. But with my 2 daughters, we didn't have a birth daughter, so when they did stuff, we were like, what the heck? What's going on? Because we didn't know as much about what was typical for them. And so just don't take things personally, but respond and address problems. Have clear boundaries. Yes?
When Carly said that Carly, right?
Uh-huh.
When she said that she gave you guys just hell for the first few years, for women, obviously you react different than men. Was it harder on your wife at times? Was she able to, like, just, you know what I mean? That's one of the things that you worry about as a woman.
It's absolutely, my experience, harder for the women. Because first of all, women by nature are more emotional than men. And so they have that tendency to get upset about it. Now, but I can't tell you, I've been upset over her behavior before too, but not as much, because the other factor that's very common in this work is for, and I've mentioned this before, in foster care and adoption, for children to reject their foster mom or adoptive mom much more than their dad. So Carly didn't say it, she may not remember it, but she called me dad a couple of times on accident, but she never called my wife mom. And so they tend to let down their guard a little bit more with dads in general than with moms. They tend to reject moms a lot more. So I always tell parents that the moms are the ones that catch all the crap. Okay? So you need to be ready and not take it personally. Okay? All right. I've mentioned this multiple times. You need to talk openly about adoption in your home. Okay? And I mentioned you need to get all the information that you can. And so prior to adoption, you have you should, it's policy, anticipate going into the DCFS office and reading the child's file. If you don't have a caseworker talking to you about that, you need to say something, because you are going to sign a document at your adoption that states you've been given all the information. So if they're saying that you can't read the file, they're wrong, because I've done it 4 times. Okay? So in fact, I sat in one of these rooms for hours looking through a folder with both of my sons, getting ready for their adoption. And that information is important, because I mentioned our lives are like a puzzle, and for your child, it's their puzzle. It's their life. They have the right to the information. Now, we always share it at an age-appropriate level. So you're not going to give them all the information at age 4. But if kids ask questions, you need to have the information. You need to have already accessed it. Take notes. There are some things you might be able to get copies of so that you have it for later. Okay? We've talked about this before too. You want to encourage them to have positive feelings about their parents. I never bag or talk negative about Carly's birth parents. I talk about the poor choices they've made, and Carly talked about them being arrested. How do you think she knew that?
Either she was there or she asked.
I brought home information and said, Carly, this is information that I found I thought you might need to know. That's it. Shared factual information. Okay? Get as much information about them that you can, because the child's going to want to know about it later. Okay? At some point in time, they're going to want to know the information, and so you need to be honest about it. If maybe they're asking you questions you don't think they're ready for, then let them know that, and let them know that, you know, if it needs to be, that can maybe be information processed in therapy, or that they can work with their therapist to be ready for that. You need to watch for distress in your child. We've talked a lot about triggers, losses, transitions. Because kids don't come up and say, hey, I'm having a hard time, I'm having a trigger right now. So Carly mentioned that she's doing that now, but she's 21. She didn't do that when she was younger. So you need to watch for those signs of distress so you can help the child recognize what's going on. And we have had to do that with all of our adopted kids. We've had to help them recognize when they're distressed and help them understand what's going on. Okay? And I just mentioned to you that the moms often get all or most of the negative behavior. It's not an absolute, because I've seen plenty of it too, but all of my adopted kids have been much more likely to direct negative behavior at my wife. Mostly, I would tell you, and they would admit this, because they've all had violent fathers, and so they see a father figure as more threatening than a mother figure. As far as physical intimidation, even though I haven't ever done that with them, because of their past memories, they feel that way. So, yes, Amy.
Now, in regards to like that, like say for instance, because I'm gonna be a single parent, how do you talk to, like, for you, you said your dad like talked to you differently. So how do you have that conversation with them to tell them that you can't talk to them the way that you talk to me? Like you have to have a conversation with them calmly, so that you don't trigger the child. So what's a good way to go about telling your family that without revealing too much information?
Are you saying your extended family, or?
Yeah, like if my parents were happening to watch them and say the kid had like an incident, and you don't want your parent
right.
that to do something to trigger them even more. So how would you have that conversation with them to make sure that they're not?
That's where you start educating people who are going to be caring for your kids about trauma, because you may not be able to tell them about your child's specific history, but you can explain trauma, and you can say, look, these guys have been through abuse and neglect, and what by people who are supposed to care for them. So that means that often parental figures, authority figures, are very threatening to them, and so you need to handle things differently. So I mentioned to you guys, if I use a loud voice with my adopted kids, that's an immediate trigger. Carly mentioned just poking her in the side, and that one moment was a trigger, so we have to be aware of that, and we can talk about triggers. It's like post-traumatic stress disorder. And so you have to help them understand that, and that the need to parent differently And to, you know, if somebody's watching your child, they can still set boundaries, but if there's an issue that comes up that needs to be dealt with, it doesn't have to necessarily be dealt with then. Just tell them, you know, you can let me know about it and I'll take care of it later if need be. Okay. All right, Catherine.
I mentioned before that I had talked to a friend of mine who had done foster care for a long time, and just kind of this whole idea of mom and dad. She said that she would never, she wouldn't allow the kids that came in for foster care to call her mom or dad because she didn't want to be associated with those feelings that the child had for their mom and their dad, as to not replace, but also as to not take on their persona as being mom or dad. So she would have them call her by her first name, however they wanted to call her.
Right.
But she didn't allow, or they could even say Mama Wendy or whatever,
Right.
but they could not call her just straight mom.
Right. Well, and that might be okay if you're just doing regular foster care and the kids are going to go back home. But imagine for Carly, she's been with us for now 15 years. Would you still have her call me Cliff? Or I'm her dad? And she, you know, so she still recognizes she has a birth father. But in her mind, in her life, I am her dad. And so that's a process. That's why, you know, I would tell you up front, yeah, don't force kids to call you mom and dad. You need to wait until they're ready, till they've processed and worked through those things, and it will come on its own time. When they're ready, it will just happen. And because if you got a 3-year-old placed in your home, they're going to call you mom right away. That's pretty common. And so how do you tell a 3-year-old, no, don't call me mom? Because a 3-year-old's not going to understand anything you try and explain. Yeah, Brielle.
With me, I was older, so in the church they required us to call our parents father and mother. So when I was adopted, I just decided that I'm going to call my biological parents father and mother still, and call my adopted parents mom and dad.
Oh.
So there's, you know,
Right.
options.
And that's another great example too, that whenever possible we give kids the choice of what they would like to do, because it's about helping them have a sense of control, okay, in this process. Luana.
We learned very quickly the adoptive father should take an active parenting role. We learned quickly that we had to make sure that the kids wouldn't end run us, so to speak. And so we both sat down and wrote down what each of us would do. And so if one child would come to the father and say all this stuff, then father would always come to me to make sure that that's really what it was. Because we found that that was really, really important, so they weren't playing each one of us.
Right.
And
Divide
so,
and conquer.
Yeah, divide and conquer.
Yeah, and that's, you know, our kids know if they come to me and ask if they can do something, my response is typically, I don't know, let me talk to mom, because I'm gone a lot more, so I want to know what's going on. And then sometimes when they ask her to do something, she'll at times say, you know what, I don't know, let me talk to dad. And if they're giving her a lot of grief, I've told her, whenever it's needed, you say, you know what, you're going to have to, dad's going to have to answer that for you, so I guess you'll just have to wait, because he won't be home until, you know, whatever time. If I'm doing pre-service, well, dad will get home at 9:30 or 10 o'clock, so you'll have to wait and talk to him then. To just try and avoid some of that, and to know that for me, and I've mentioned to you guys that I have an issue with my kids treating my wife disrespectfully. So there's a clear line, a boundary that they know that I don't allow that. And so you need to have that clear communication.
How do you set that boundary?
How do you set it?
Yeah.
Well, you just let kids know what that boundary is. It doesn't mean they haven't ever crossed that line, but it means that I enforce it. I set that line more with my kids than my wife does about how they treat her. because I won't tolerate it. Okay? Doesn't mean that I'm going to lock them in a room or throw them out a window or anything, but I set that boundary, and I've restated many times that behavior is not acceptable in my home. Okay? And that's really important, especially because all of them have come from homes where they saw a father be violent to a mother. Okay? And so with boys especially who see that, if that doesn't get corrected, the likelihood is they're going to grow up and do the same thing. Okay. All right, we've talked about this a lot too. Because control is such a big issue, whenever possible, you need to just let it go. And pick your battles wisely. Anything that you don't absolutely need to control, don't control it, and let the child have some control. Because there are things that you're going to have to set the boundary, and you're going to have to hold them to that. Okay. All right, so we've already talked a lot about the fact that you do need to talk to your child about their history. But what if it's really negative? Catherine.
They still need to know, no matter how negative it is. Like you said, at whatever level they're at, you can age appropriately tell them whatever, but they need to see the good and the bad in life, because we all have good and bad, and they need to understand that. You don't want to sugarcoat it for them. So
Right.
that, like Carly was saying, when she went to visit with her, or meet her parents, to try to get a hold of them, she hadn't had some of that information to understand some of the background. She'd go into it with
Right.
different, perspective on how it was going to turn out or what was going to happen,
Right.
and get totally blindsided. Now that can happen anyway, but giving her that ammunition as she's going in, knowing that they have been to jail and they've done this, but they've also done this, these
Right.
good and bad things, then it's not totally sugarcoated to the fact that they're like, oh, my parents are saints.
Yeah.
When that's not truly what it is. You don't want to have that be their perception before an interaction.
Yeah. David.
I think depending on how old they are, speak in their language, or as far as how much their mind can handle or take in, like a sponge.
Yeah.
I wouldn't throw it all at them at once, but I don't know, just kind of speak in how they would understand, or
Yeah.
in their terms.
Yeah, that becomes really important because, like I said, when Carly was 7 years old in our home, or 8 years old, sharing every little detail about her parents' past, how helpful would that be? Wouldn't. So when kids are younger, so we talked about being honest. So when at 7 years old, they say, well, how come I can't go back with my birth parents? We need to be honest and say something like, well, your mom and dad have problems that they're trying to work on, but, and depending on the situation, if there's still reunification. And so your caseworker, because kids by 7 or 8 know about their caseworker, your caseworker is trying to help them work on their problems. But then if they can't go back home, well, your parents have problems, and the state identified that you're not safe to live with them, and so the state's asked us to take care of you. And so along that line, there's a really good handout on starting on 122 that's an article about talking to your child about their past, their history, especially if it's a very negative history. So Carla came in here and explained to you that her parents used drugs, methamphetamine specifically, along with multiple other drugs. her father was arrested for manufacturing methamphetamine. That's pretty hard stuff to hear. But she knows that information because that's her history. She has the right to it. So this gives tips about how to do that. And especially when kids are working through this, that's something that it shouldn't always be you sharing that information. I would highly recommend that that's being handled in therapy, or that a caseworker is sharing that with them, because if we talk about divided loyalties and you are now telling this child about how horrible their parents are, how do you think that's going to work?
They're going to want to revert back to siding with their birth parents.
Right. So we need to be careful. They need to know that you know the information. So if that's being discussed in therapy, you should probably be there, but you shouldn't always be the bad guy giving them all that information.
Usually they would try to blame the messenger.
Right.
You know, like the saying goes, I'm just the messenger. Let that
Right.
be the therapist. Be the
Yep. Yeah, let the therapist be the bad guy. Let the caseworker be the bad guy. You know, with Carly, when I came across an arrest record for her father, her birth father, I printed it out in the news, brought it home and said, thought you might want to know this. And that was it. Okay. All right, so that was when she was 17. I wouldn't have done that when she was 7. But, you know, she's getting ready. She's almost out of high school. And so that's information that a teenager can handle and needs to know. So by the time they're 18, they should know all of their history that you know. Okay? And so our kids, you know, our 2 girls do. They know everything that we know. We've had many conversations. Because, you know, the 6th element is helping them develop a strength-based understanding of their life story. So I think Carly's pretty much there. You know, there's still things she's working through, still things she's working on, but it's her puzzle. She deserves to have every piece filled in that she can. That's why she was contacting her birth parents, because she's trying to fill in the pieces. And it's a natural, typical thing for kids, adopted children to do. So far, 3 of my 4 adopted children have contacted their birth parents on Facebook. And with social media, it's going to get easier and easier. So you can't avoid it. If they want to do it, it's going to happen. Okay? And it's something you just have to know and prepare for and anticipate. All right, so we've talked about when to tell and a lot about how to tell already. But I want to touch on these last couple of things up here, talking with family, friends, the schools, and the community. How much information do all of those different parties have the right to know?
As little as possible. Need to know basis. If there's a danger, then it needs to be brought up. But I think the more you tell, the more it opens up issues.
Okay. Well, so I'm gonna pick on you for a minute, Sean. So you guys have kids. So you also have parents. So your kids have grandparents. So how much do your kids' grandparents know about them?
I mean, just only things we tell them.
They know everything. My mom does. I don't know about who's more certain.
Okay. So that's where this becomes challenging, because if you're talking about talking with family, and this is about a child that you've adopted, they're a permanent member of your family. So that's where this then becomes complicated. Because if my mom knows pretty much everything about my birth children, do I just say, well, sorry, Mom, you don't get to know that about Carly because she's adopted?
My mom's really excited. She feels what I feel. She's very, I don't know, we're best friends, but with his family, it's more surface. But she's content with that.
Right. And that's actually a perfect example that every family is different. Okay? So, my wife and I come from big families. She's from a family of 10 kids. I'm from a family of 12 kids. Okay? Her family is, as you mentioned, Rachel, much more open, and they talk about everything. Okay? So when my daughter got married a couple weeks ago, we had like 15 extra people at our house that were all from her side of the family. My side of the family is more reserved. But so how does that need to be any different with an adopted child in your home that you've adopted? So there, first of all, I would always tell you the child's history is their history, so they have the right to determine some of that. You don't go share everything. Okay? But it's also dependent on each individual in your family. So I have several siblings that are much more involved in my life. They know a lot more about my adopted kids. So my older brother, who's 2 years older than me, he's much more connected with my two sons, and recently talked to me about, hey, I want to take Joe and Preston out camping. Can I steal him for a weekend? So he knows a lot more about them because he's involved in their lives. So when we talk about family, it depends, okay, on that person and what right and privilege they've earned to that information. The same is true with friends. So I have friends that know that I've adopted kids from foster care, and that's about it. That's about all they know. They know their names. But then I have friends who are like family in my life that know a lot more about my kids and their background because they've earned that right and privilege, and my kids will talk to them about that stuff. Okay? Because we talk about adoption a lot in our lives. Now, with the schools specifically, the school needs to know whatever information will help them provide an appropriate education for your child. You may have a child who needs an IEP, and the school then needs to know why. Okay? I had a child in my home, not one that we adopted, but who had some significant issues in his previous school. He basically was almost expelled from his previous school. So in coming into our home, the school needed to understand if they pushed him and pushed him, he was going to blow. And so we talked a lot with them about his history and understanding that. And he didn't have a single problem at the school while he was in our home because we shared the right information with them that was necessary to help them understand how to work with him about his trauma history. Okay? But they didn't know everything about him. So what they needed to provide an appropriate education. So there may be many people at the school that don't know that my two sons are adopted. but there are others who do. And the same, once again, same thing in the community. Okay? So the bottom line, once again, is remember that your child's history is their history. So you don't have the right to go share that with everyone whenever, however you want to. It's their history. We would feel no different about anybody sharing our deepest, darkest secrets with anybody else.
When the children are in foster care, though, don't you have more limitations about what you can say and what you can't say?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely, because of confidentiality and care.
Like you can't post pictures on Facebook, and you
Correct.
There's a lot of things you can and cannot
Right.
do when they are a foster child in your home,
Absolutely.
as opposed to being adopted.
Absolutely correct. All right. So, when we talk about adoption in general terms, they've identified that there are stages of adjustment that are typically seen that happens as part of this process. Now, we can't give you exact time frames on these things, but what we can just talk about is a little bit what they look like. So the first stage is when a child's placed in a home for adoption, there's a period of time where you're getting acquainted, where you're getting to know them and they're getting to know you, and it's a process. So I talked with you guys about that with our two sons. We gave them family books before they got to our home that had pictures of us and information about us, so that when they came to our home, they knew a little bit about us. Depending on the scenario, if you're taking in a child and the placement is an adoptive placement up front, that looks a lot different from a regular foster placement. So if, for example, if you were taking a child off of the adoption exchange, that was a child that's waiting for an adoptive placement, that can be a slow process where they're taking time, making sure you have information, getting more information about you, introducing you to the child, and there can be a transition that happens. But for all kids, there's that getting acquainted process that may be anywhere from a couple days to a couple weeks, where they're just getting to know about you and you're getting to know about them. Yes?
So we're thinking about adopting. So can you just let the caseworker know that you've looked at those kids on the adoption exchange?
Yeah, once you're licensed as a foster parent, if you are on the exchange and you see a child you're interested in, you make an inquiry. That inquiry will get sent to the exchange office in Salt Murray. They'll then notify the caseworker that somebody's interested. They'll usually request from DCFS a copy of your home study. They'll usually talk to you, answer questions, and they'll have questions for you. And so it's a process that usually takes some time. Yes?
But is it different for every state? Because we've seen, on adoption exchange and stuff, we see them from other states. Isn't it a bigger process?
It's a much longer process with another state. And I personally would tell you there's plenty of kids here in Utah that need families. So we would encourage you whenever possible, look at kids here because the need is here. Okay, but yeah, it is much longer when they're out of state.
Ours was that way. We were in Nebraska, and we adopted our kids out of Nevada, but only basically because the whole foster care system was in an uproar in Nebraska for some reason. There'd been some kind of thing that happened or scandal or whatever, and so we ended up getting kids out of Nevada instead.
Right. Yeah. All right. Next stage is honeymoon phase. And that's typically the stage or phase where everybody's on best behavior. The child is trying to be perfect. You're trying to be really patient and loving and sometimes that honeymoon's really short. I've had a kid in my home that it was very short. May not have even really happened. But then I've had, how many of you have teenagers? Okay, how many of you have teenagers whose rooms are perfectly clean every day? Okay. Our younger son was placed in our home, and I kid you not, for about 6 months, his room was perfectly clean every morning. Okay, so I don't remember who it was that asked me about nifty needy, or, okay. So I could walk into his room, and on his end table I could move something 3 inches, and he would come home and know it had been moved. Okay. So that honeymoon phase for him went on for quite a while. And we were trying to push him and say, look, you know, I wanted to go in and mess up his room. So he knew he could just be a kid. Okay. But so, once again, every child's different, but just know that that honeymoon phase isn't going to last. And that's probably a good thing. Next stage is ambivalence, where kids and parents are both kind of starting to go, well, I don't know, this could work. You know, so when Carly hit ambivalent, she's like, well, okay, maybe I'll call them mom and dad. I guess that would be okay. I'm still not sure if I really like them, but I'll give it a shot. And the parents going, well, this seems like it's okay, it could work. It's, you know, I'm starting to feel a little bit closer to them. And then finally, you start to see what's called reciprocal interaction. Things become more natural. They feel more like family. And with younger kids, this process can go extremely fast. With teenagers, it's typically much slower. Okay? And so, and it will go on, you know, finally you'll get to bond solidification. So, obviously, with Carly, we're there. Bond solidification. We are her parents. She sees it that way. We see her as our daughter. Often, that bond solidification happens for parents much quicker than for the child, if it's an older child. Carly talked about for years, she wasn't quite sure about us. But for us, there was no turning back. Okay? But so just know if you don't feel that immediate bond solidification, that doesn't mean necessarily something's wrong. Now, if it's been 10 years and you don't feel a bond, there might be a little bit of a problem. Okay? But just don't get upset if it's not happening quickly, because some cases it will happen very fast, but others it's going to take some time. Okay? All right, so I want to talk about, oh, Katie Jo.
So you talked about how you didn't feel like you felt this bond with one of your sons until like the day you were filling out adoption papers. Like, is that normal? Like, I know that you're saying it takes time, and that's fine, but like, should we be walking down adoption road if I don't feel connected yet? Like, do you know what I'm saying?
Every kid's going to be different, and that's why I'm pointing that out. With one child, you may feel that bond really quick. With another child, it might not be much that way, and part of that is up to you. And as you do this, you'll understand more. With my 2 sons, I didn't take them in because I needed more kids. I took them in because they needed a home, and we knew how to do this, and we knew that they were meant to be with us. But when an 11 or a 13-year-old's telling you to go to hell, that's really hard to make a bond. Okay, and so it's very different for a teenager sometimes than it is with a young, a 3-month-old or a 2-year-old. They're going to usually bond to you pretty quick. So just know with teenagers, with older kids who are more oppositional, it's hard to build that bond when they're always constantly rejecting you. Okay? And so it's every kid's different. Real.
So I helped my nieces and nephews with my parents. My biological parents had like 60 before I left. So I've been raising children but it was different. They weren't foster kids, but I had I had some that were. But I just noticed with the younger children, they don't just say go to hell, but they kind of scream. Like you're gonna have days when they scream and scream and scream.
Yeah.
And that's their way of, it's kind of similar, but it's just the change in their mind they can't understand. So it's different, but it's similar.
Yeah, we experience, in my opinion, more challenges with our 6-year-old daughter than we did with our teenagers because, 6-year-old that screams and throws tantrums all day long, I can reason more with a teenager than I can a 6-year-old. So, all right, so I want to talk about resources. Even after adoption, you need to access support. So the first thing I want to talk about is training. So I've mentioned the clusters. That's a common place where you can go to get ongoing training on a regular basis. Okay? Because you're going to come across things that we haven't talked about. Because I can't talk about everything in here. And we've had meetings specifically about adoption-related issues. We've had groups before of adoptive parents get together for things. So you need to access training and get help all the way through because, Carly is 21. And when you adopt, that means that they're going to be around in your life for a long time. Okay? So we're not done with Carly. She's still involved in our lives. We still are very much involved in her life. And so it's a long-term process. Know that there are associations out there that are designed to provide support. So one example of that is in Utah, we have an association statewide. I'm going to pass around these cards, one per couple. That's known as Foster Families of Utah. And Foster Families of Utah is an organization for foster and adopted parents to provide support and help. So the handout gives you a little information about them as well as contact information. So they're a great resource. Now, you're always welcome in the clusters after you've adopted a child for as long as you want to come. I've seen adopted parents that are several years into adoption that are still attending cluster meetings. And one of the things I want to talk about are what are called adoption subsidies. So if you look starting on page 126, you're going to see a handout that talks about adoption subsidies. So on this handout, at the top of it, it talks about what qualifies a child for a subsidy. Okay? Every child adopted from foster care will be screened for an adoption subsidy. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean there's a couple of different parts to an adoption subsidy that I'm going to talk about, but what determines how they qualify and what resources you have access to with an adoption subsidy depends on the child and their issues. Has nothing to do with you. So I would highly encourage you, if you're looking to adopt, to read that handout, be familiar with that handout. So it talks about 3 different types of subsidies: maintenance, non-recurring costs, and special services. So I want to talk about those, and I want to start with non-recurring costs. So anybody in here ever thought about doing a private adoption? A couple of you. So what's it cost to do a private adoption? $25,000 plus. Depending on the child, depending on the circumstances, it's expensive. So many families can't qualify for that. So if you're looking at adopting a child from foster care, how much does that cost? It's a trick question. Okay? So you might have a typical cost up front of adopting a child from foster care, easily of anywhere from $800 up to maybe $1,400. That's a pretty typical cost. You pay that cost up front. That's for the adoption petition. That's for a court filing fee. That's for vital statistics for a new birth certificate. But then after the adoption is finalized, the state reimburses that cost to you. So technically, afterwards, there's no out-of-pocket cost. Now, there are also times and circumstances where there may be other adoption-related costs, like if you adopt a child from a different state. Some states have required parents to travel to that state for the adoption. That would be an adoption-related expense that you might get a little help with. But the total non-recurring cost that can be covered is up to $2,000. Okay. So that's covered by subsidy. Now, the second part I want to talk about is the maintenance subsidy. So in maintenance subsidy, there's 2 parts to that. The first part is a Medicaid card for all children adopted from foster care. They will have a Medicaid card until they turn 18 the way that typically works is they anticipate your insurance acting as primary insurance and Medicaid acting as secondary insurance, which typically means you have very little, if any, out-of-pocket medical costs for a child that you've adopted. There are some random exceptions to that. There are some things that Medicaid won't cover that will just happen. But
does Medicaid cover like all the therapy sessions they're going to go to?
I'm getting there. That was my next thing. Medicaid will cover therapy costs provided that you go to a therapist that is approved for Medicaid. Okay? So there are specific therapists here. The main provider here in St. George is Southwest Behavioral Health. Okay? That's the main provider, but not the only one that's covered by Medicaid. Okay? Now, The other part of the maintenance subsidy is the child may be approved for some ongoing financial help after adoption. Now, that financial help can never be more than 75% of what your foster care payment was. Okay? So if you adopted a 4-year-old who was level 1, you can anticipate on a monthly basis that you are getting as your foster care reimbursement about $480. Okay? So that means your subsidy could never be more than 75% of that. Now, often subsidies are much, much less because it's based on the child's needs. So if you adopt a younger child with very few issues, you can expect a very small financial subsidy. Okay? If you adopt a very ungovernable 13-year-old, it might look a little bit different. Okay? So that's something you have to keep in mind. It's not based on you at all. It's based on the child and their needs. The last part of subsidies is referred to as special services. And special services would refer to a child having special needs not covered by insurance or other subsidies that come up in the child's life that you can request help from DCFS. So you would go to the post-adoption worker, make a request for that. That would be screened by a committee, and if it gets approved, that would then be reimbursed to you typically. Okay. Yes, Alana.
There's help from the military too, if you're a military family, or I'm not sure if it does for the National Guard and things like that, but it's worth looking into to find out what they can do to help.
Right. And there, depending on the situation, those of you who adopt, depending on your employer, you may even be able to access things like FMLA, depending on your situation. Okay. But I would just encourage you to read through that handout. That's pretty important. It has really good information. All right. I've talked about the clusters, the support groups. They're really important. Other things that you can have access to are crisis intervention. So DCFS have what are called post-adoption workers. And so I'm going to pass this handout to you guys. This is a list of post-adoption services that they provide. On this side, it has a little bit of information about that. On this column is a list of post-adoption workers statewide. Then on the other side, it has more information about what post-adoption services are. So it's a great resource to access, to get support. And I would highly encourage you to get support early on if you're having challenges and troubles. Don't wait until you want to give the child away. Get that help as soon as you can so that they can connect you with resources. I know both of the workers in our region. We're Southwest region, so I know Gwen Fund and Angie Morrill very well. Both of them are licensed therapists. Both of them have a lot of experience. And by the way, one other thing for all of you, if you are going to adopt a child from foster care, the state has a required training that you must complete before adoption. It's known as the Pathways class or Pathways training. So they offer it usually in our region probably at least 5 or 6 times a year in this area. So just know that it's out there, and that would be a requirement, or is supposed to be a requirement before adoption. Pathways class, pathways training. Okay. All right, we've also talked about networking with other families, getting support that way. So other things I wanted to mention, with having Medicaid and having a child in therapy, one of the things I would say is you need to be involved in your child's therapy. Okay. Carly mentioned that I came to therapy with her and that it was brutal because for me it's a little bit different because I am a therapist. But you need to be involved because they often need help and support working through that, and it can create challenges in your family. So we've had family therapy sessions before. Okay. That was part of Carly's therapy, is having siblings in there and talking about problems and issues. So that's something that the Medicaid will help cover as long as you're working through a Medicaid therapist. You can access respite care even after adoption. Now, you can do that informally. That's a given, because I don't know if you guys are like me. I've had times where I've had family watch my kids so my wife and I could go on a trip. But it can also be formalized. If you're having significant challenges, a child can be placed somewhere to give you a break and give the child a break. Okay? That can be part of post-adoption services. I mentioned that in adoption, you have a right to read the child's entire file. You have a right to access that information. If you so choose, you can actually file what's called a grandma request with the division to get access to that information after adoption. Okay? And another thing I would suggest doing, once you've adopted a child, you can go to the hospital where they were born, and you can request a copy of their birth records. And that can have important information in it. It may have some medical information that will be helpful for you to know. My girls, we got their birth records, and that was important to them. Carly, it was especially important because she verified she's 7 minutes older than her twin brother. Okay. That's very important. But it was also just important. All kids like to know about that story about when they were born, how much they weighed, how long they were, what time of the day they were born. We got that information. Okay? And so that's something that for kids may be really important about their history and their story. Okay? And then finally, if you have teenagers who are adopted, there are even some of them that will struggle. They may need treatment. They may need drug treatment. They may need resources. And that's something that post-adoption services can help you access. Okay. All right, so as we finish things up tonight, I would just encourage you to consider what you learned, what you're walking away from here with that you didn't know before, and what else you need to access to gain more information. So one example of that, the last page or two in your binder has a list of books that they would recommend regarding adoption-related topics. And on the Adoption Exchange website, they have what is known as a lending library. So all licensed foster parents and all adoptive parents can access that lending library for free. And they will ship books, videos, talk tapes, CDs to your home with the postage to ship it back after a couple of weeks. So it's a great resource. All right, so are there any last thoughts or questions? Yes?
So, since you have biological kids first before you brought in the foster kids from foster care, so do you think is it more difficult or easier for a couple that didn't have any children in the home?
The only thing I could say to that is it may be a challenge because you don't know what kids are typically like because you haven't had them. But at the same time, that may not be a bad thing because you don't have set expectations. So it could be that you don't know any different. So it's hard to say because every situation will be different. As long as you are just paying attention and you're following the stuff we've talked about, I think it can be fine. So, any other thoughts or questions? Yes.
Back way before they used to steer away from adoption through foster. Now it's a huge thing. Like now you can talk about it and foster through. Why don't more people do it this way? Because you learn more. That's kind of what steered us this way. Is you learn more about the child than you would just adopting some random child from.
Right.
Is it harder? Is it? You're saying there's a lot of kids in the adoption system now, like their parents have lost their rights. Is it just not enough families? Are there only just foster parents that don't want to adopt?
My two sons were two of those kids. So what happens is you have kids that go through a couple placements because they have challenges, they're hard, and people give up on them. And then, like Carly said, she knows the difference between what we deal with our sons as compared to her. There's differences because it's harder for a child who's had 9 placements to trust or a child who's had 11 placements to trust. And so many of those kids on the exchange are kids that have had multiple placements. So they can be more challenging. And so that's why they're very careful because they don't want those placements to fail. And that's why when all of you look at taking placements, it would be much better for you to say no thanks up front than for you to give a child back 6 months later. Okay. All right. Anything else? Okay, if not, I think we're done. So thank you for being here. I want to remind